Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the George W. Norris Legislative Chamber. The afternoon session is about to reconvene. Senators, please record your presence. Roll call. Mr. Clerk, please record.
Mr. Quorum present, Mr. President.
Do you have any items for the record?
I do, Mr. President. Communication to the Secretary of State concerning Legislative Bill 307. Additionally, your Committee on Enrollment Review reports Legislative Bill 644, 895 to as placed on final, correctly engrossed and placed on final reading. Additionally, your Committee on Enrollment Review reports Legislative Bill 856A, 857A, 1035A, 685A, and 1087A to select file. Amendments to be printed from Senator Brewer to LB 399 and Senator Aguilar to LB 926 and Senator Mosier to LB 484, Senator Ibach 262. Additionally, notice that the Revenue Committee will be holding executive session in room 2022 at 2 o'clock today. Revenue Committee exec session, room 2022 at 2 o'clock. That's all I have this time, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. While the legislature is in session and capable of transacting business, I do propose to sign and do hereby sign Legislative Resolution 315. Speaker Arch announces some guests in the north balcony. Members from the Leadership Sarpy, the Sarpy County Chamber, please stand and be recognized by your Nebraska Legislature. Mr. Clerk, for agenda items.
Mr. President, first item on the agenda, General File Legislative Bill 1412. As it concerns Legislative Bill 1412, Mr. President, I have a motion. Senator Michaela Cavanaugh moved to indefinitely postpone the bill pursuant to Rule 6, Section 3F.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Senator Clements, you're recognized to open.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I want to thank the Appropriations Committee for their hard work as we met every session day, hearing many budget proposals. LB 1412 is the mainline budget bill. And I want to thank Vice Chair Wishart and Senators McDonald, Vargas, Erdman, Dorn, Armendariz, Dover, and Lippincott for your many hours of listening and discussions. I also would like to thank Keisha Patent, our fiscal analyst, and all of the budget analysts in the Legislative Fiscal Office for their hard work and expertise. LB 1412 is the governor's mid-biennium mainline budget adjustment bill. The Appropriations Committee advanced LB 1412 to general file with AM 2566 on a 9-0 vote. The committee started with the governor's recommendations as outlined in his budget book in January. The committee then reviewed the requests of agencies wanting changes from their current budgets. The committee preliminary report contained those changes that were approved. Then we held public hearings to hear from each agency and the public regarding those agency requests. Next, we had public hearings on 59 bills with budget requests totaling about $250 million of new general fund spending and $108 million in federal ARPA fund requests. There were about $38 million in unused ARPA funds, which were reallocated as described later. That ends my opening remarks for LB 1412, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Clemens. As stated, there is a priority motion. Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, you're recognized to open.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, colleagues. Motion 1244. I chose to do this motion with the Rule 6, Section 3F, because it blocks the committee amendment. So right now, if this were to go to a cloture vote, which I'm not entirely sure how that would work on the budget, but if it were, we would only vote on the budget as introduced by the governor. So that's just to explain what that motion is. I want to say something. I stayed off the mic this morning because Well, frankly, if it was a political vote against Senator Hunt, I didn't think me talking was going to be helpful. It was a disappointing vote. And it was disappointing for this body to see that we cannot rely on one another to support one another. That was disappointing. But for those of you who are new to this body, who voted against the veto override, I want to tell you about how I got here. I ran for the legislature in 2018. I started out running against a Republican incumbent in a Republican district in Omaha. And I did that. I didn't wait until it was an open seat. I ran against a Republican incumbent in a Republican seat in Omaha in 2018 because in 2017, the governor line item vetoed funding for developmental disabilities. And she stood on this floor and spoke out against that, left the floor, presumably got a call from the governor, and came back and did not vote to override that veto. That was the moment that I turned to my husband and literally said, I have to run, because if she's not willing to stand up for vulnerable people, she shouldn't be there. And I guarantee that there were people in your districts today having that same conversation this morning. That vote was purely political. It wasn't good governance, and it is disappointing. But now we are on to another three-ring circus, the budget. And I think we should all get comfortable because, first of all, the budget is really important, and we should be taking time to discuss it. Now, last year, when I was up here discussing the budget, all of the members of the Appropriations Committee seemed to evaporate from the floor of the legislature. I hope that doesn't happen this year because I'm not going to be the only person speaking. Clearly, there are people in the queue that want to speak. But you should be here. You should be present to answer questions from your colleagues. And it is disrespectful for you not to be here to defend your work, because 9 of you are putting this forward to 40 others of us. And we expect answers to our questions, and our questions are legitimate. Starting with, on page 44 of the Appropriations Committee adjustments, we see a reduction to public assistance and a reduction to behavioral health. And I am just going to telepath right now that that is something that I am going to want answers for. If the reason that we are reducing behavioral health is because they didn't spend the money, why didn't they spend the money? All we have heard about is how we have a behavioral health crisis in this state. So what do we need to change in statute to ensure that this money is being utilized for the intended purpose instead of clawing it back for something else? The same with public assistance. Why isn't it being used? We know that we have people in crisis. We know we have people who need public assistance. And if we are going to claw back $30 million in public assistance, why is that $30 million not being used for the Medicaid unwind to kick poor people off of Medicaid? Instead, we're going to claw the Medicaid excess fund, the fund that should be used for Medicaid services, not to kick people off Medicaid. You're going to hear from my colleagues that the budget is a moral document. And I, year after year, question our morals based on this document. It is extraordinarily concerning that we continually slash funds that go to underserved populations. I have emails from my constituents constantly asking me, why does the Nebraska legislature hate poor people? Why do we hate poor people? That's not an email I enjoy getting, because I am here to fight for everyone. And I would hope that you would join me in that. But a moral document should reflect that, and it doesn't. What it reflects is cutting spending to vulnerable populations to pad our pockets so that we can afford major tax cuts for the wealthy. That's not moral. How much time do I have, Mr. President?
3 minutes, 52 seconds.
I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to Senator Wayne.
Senator Wayne, you have 3 minutes, 45 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. President. So there are a lot of problems that I'm seeing right now. And don't worry, a 9-0 vote out of appropriations shouldn't mean anything to this body because it doesn't mean 8-0 coming out of judiciary. So we'll start there. So if anybody gets up and says this came out 9-0, I'm personally going to have a conversation one-on-one on the mic about why that matters, because it didn't matter for judiciary. So we'll start there. Second, I'm going to be filing motions through 3 rounds. That's going to remove every bill that was listed in there. And we're going to take votes straight up and down on each bill, because I'm trying to figure out even the bills that cost nothing. The problem that I've been seeing over the last 8 years is what I would say a disrespect to the committee process by the executive board and now the appropriations board by putting bills in appropriations that have no business belong there. Senator Hansen and I brought a bill last year to make sure that we have Florida calls it a sunset committee that reviews every program. Instead, what we've done in Nebraska in this unicameral is we started moving bills of committee and jurisdiction that have programmatic and statutory changes into an appropriation process. That is fundamentally wrong. My first 2 years, we went through tons of debate around Title 10 or Title X, whatever that was in the Title 10. And balconies were full. And the one thing Stenner said over and over, which I agree with, was we shouldn't put these type of statutory language program changes in the appropriation process, that there is a committee of jurisdiction. And I have to look no further. Wasn't expecting to go this early, but that's great. If you turn to page 4 of this handy dandy green book, you'll see that there's some bills that are incorporated that have zero fiscal. LB 850, Senator Jacobson. I support the language changes he is doing. I do not support those changes coming from appropriations. That should have went to banking, government, or urban affairs. By the way, now we've expanded our housing program. We can hear number 3 in the country, or number 3 issues across the state, top 3 issues. We don't have a place for it in this body. Some housing programs go to urban affairs, some go to HHS, some go to, believe it or not, natural resources, and some even go now to appropriations along with government. But it should not go to appropriations for changes in statutory language. Another one that has zero is Senator Frederickson. It's an earmark regarding university appropriation. That one may stay there because I printed out one. So it may actually deal with an appropriation. But I'll tell you one that doesn't is Senator McDonald's change to the language of lead service line funds, changes to the definition of nursing scholarship, earmark language. Those are statutory changes that should go to the jury of, or the committee of jurisdiction. That's not complicated. That is an end around the entire process. If a bill on the floor, let's say Senator Bostar's child care bill, isn't attached, nor is it passed.
Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Wayne. Senator Conrad, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. I rise in support of the motion, and I thank Senator Kavanaugh for bringing it forward. I want to continue some of the comments that my friend Senator Wayne started on here today. Friends, as an 8-year member of the Appropriations Committee, during my previous time in the legislature, I've spent a lot of time and energy reviewing budgets and very familiar with the process and the issues, and I can tell you what has emanated from the Appropriations Committee in regards to this mid-biennial budget adjustment. It is not thoughtful, and it is not appropriate, and it is filled with nothing but budgetary tricks to bend and twist and borrow and steal and sweep money away from intended purposes, away from Nebraskans who most need it, and for what? For what? For what policy basis? Allegedly, it's to meet some made-up number from the governor's office about a reduction in local property taxes of 40%. Let me remind you of a couple of things. We are at a time of economic prosperity. We are not at a time of recession. We are not at a time of dwindling receipts. Look no further than the financial status. Look no further than the general fund reports that come out every single month. And look at the fact that we are in a time of economic prosperity. What this budget looks like, in fact, in many ways, if not worse than, is a budget that would emanate from the Appropriations Committee in a time of economic downturn, when we are borrowing and stealing from cash funds to balance the budget. That is divorced from the economic reality that we find ourselves in, number one. Okay, so let's not get like too deep into made up debate about the finer points of certain aspects of the budget without forgetting that global note. What we've also have as part of the governor's plan in regards to this arbitrary 40% tax cut goal is a companion proposal making its way through the Revenue Committee to increase taxes. So from the Revenue Committee, we have proposals that are making their way forward to increase taxes. We have a budget before us to cut services and to steal money from otherwise intended purposes, to move forward with an unrealistic, arbitrary 40% property tax reduction at a time of economic prosperity. That is bad politics and bad policy. I appreciate Senator Kavanaugh for bringing this forward, because we can and we will settle in to talk a lot about the cuts and the sweeps to behavioral health, which are wrong, about the sweeps from the state settlement funds that were brought to us by various attorney generals because Nebraska consumers were harmed. They were not brought to this state for property tax cuts. And I hope the appropriations committees have done their homework, each and every member, all 9, because we're going to go through those settlement dollars together on the mic. And you can rationalize on the record how you made those sweeps. So get ready, because I'm preparing to call that out in my next times on the mic. Additionally, we're going to talk about how these sweeps hurt the poor, the poorest among us, the most vulnerable Nebraskans. Many of you weren't able to attend an event that we had in the Rotunda just today with scores of Nebraskans who stepped forward.
1 minute.
Who serve folks with developmental disabilities, who have developmental disabilities, and who love loved ones with developmental disabilities. And they called upon this body to make sure that they were here today, not just for a photo op with the governor, but for real action. That we put our money where our mouth is, and the timing couldn't be better, because we're going to have the opportunity to do that together or not. This is about policy, this is a moral document, and this is divorced from the economic reality that our state finds itself in, and we're going to have a lot of time to talk about it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Conrad. Senator McDonald, you're welcome. You're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, colleagues. I want to thank Senator Clements and all the people that serve on appropriations, also fiscal office, for all the time they put in and the assistance they give us, and all their knowledge and experience they bring to the table. This isn't an easy process, and it shouldn't be. We're talking about the budget for the state of Nebraska. So as Appropriations Committee, we do spend a lot of time together because we're the only 5-day committee. There's a number of bills that come in front of us, number of requests. The governor proposes and we depose as the committee. And then part of the process is we bring it to the members on the floor. So we are excited about talking about the budget because this is what we work on 90% of the time throughout the year outside of our own personal priority bills or bills we introduce in different committees. So the idea of bills being brought up and where they're assigned, I don't make those decisions. But if a bill is assigned to appropriations, we take it extremely seriously. And based on whatever that reason might be, we go through the process and we have the hearing. We go into executive session and we talk about those bills. Senator Wayne has brought up two of the bills that I introduced, LB 1099, the nurse scholarship that was approved in the last budget, and also 1245, which is the lead service that was approved in the last budget. So this year, there was no fiscal notes, but on the nurses bill, we had a mistake that was put in place based on, we forgot about the quarterly system from the community colleges. The idea of the semester and how you reimburse students that way. So we wanted to make sure we had cleanup language for the quarterly system. Lead service, we had to look at the grant process, how that worked, because it had been sitting there based on replacing lead service pipes to homes, which we know all the damage that can do to the next generation, based on the idea that if we could look at homes built before World War II, before 1945, those were the homes that really needed the most assistance. So we had appropriated through a budget that was already approved $10 million. What we were having is a problem with some of the grant process. So we wanted to do that cleanup language. So we can get in and as detailed as everyone wants, because this is part of the process, and you should be asking those questions. But I don't think we should take away the work that people have done, that senators that brought us the legislation, the appropriations. And again, we don't always agree within appropriations, and we go into exec session, we have those discussions. But I am proud that we got to the point where on LB 1412, we came out with a 9-0 vote from appropriations. Not easy. And again, the process should never be easy because we're dealing with the taxpayers' dollars. But at the same time, it's a good process. I've been part of it. Been honored to serve on the Appropriations Committee for 8 years now. And I believe we've brought you a fair budget. Again, the governor proposes, we depose. We didn't agree with the governor on everything, and we didn't agree with each other on everything, or the senators that brought their bills. But we got to the point where we felt this was the best bill to bring in front of you, and we stand behind it as appropriations, again, voting 9-0. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator McDonald. Senator Wayne, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I'm going through the fiscal note and I'm actually reading the language, and let me back up. Let me start from a premise. I'm not sure how these conversations go. I'm not sure how the conversations with the governor's office goes. But I remember last year getting a veto on a budget line item for $15 million for PTSD. And it was said that was because North Omaha and South Omaha already got too much money. So when you have these budget conversations, do we just write off North Omaha and South Omaha because we already got some money that really hasn't been deployed yet? And then if that's the principle, we're going to start having a conversation on this floor about that same principle being applied to everything, including daycares, including job training. When is enough enough? We gave $15 million, $20 million to community colleges to boost workforce. We gave another $15 million job training to boost workforce. And we're giving more money for daycares to boost workforce while we're sweeping money away from behavioral health. Every year I get on the floor around the budget and I'm just at awe, and it's moving in the wrong direction. Why are we changing provisions to the Innovation Business Act through appropriation when there is a committee of jurisdiction that is doing that? That is going to, for every committee chair, that is going to, you're getting ran around. And maybe that's the process we want to start doing, which is fine. But here's what I will tell you. Every one of these transfers that involve ARPA dollars is a vote against your commitment to North and South Omaha. And you may say how, and some of you may be running for office. It's easy, it's in statute. Unobligated funds at the end of this year are supposed to automatically transfer over to the Economic Recovery Fund. That was a deal we made on this floor. Yet I am seeing vote after vote by senators in Omaha moving ARPA dollars when the statute says that we're not going to do that. So every ARPA dollar that is being transferred, we're going to have a conversation about over the next couple of hours. We're going to have a conversation on select file and on final reading. Because the current statute is unobligated funds at the end of this biennium 2024 moving to North and South Omaha. That was the commitment this body made. 47-1, following year 44. But yet I am seeing ARPA dollars being moved to roads. I'd rather see those ARPA dollars go to sustainable beef, because at least those are permanent jobs we're creating than construction crews moving around the state, not creating new jobs, one-time funding. One-time funding that we're supposed to change some things for those who are in poverty. We still never addressed the lead pipes going across this entire state, but particularly in the suburbs, Elkhorn of Omaha. ARPA was supposed to be used for that. A special provision was laid out for those kind of sewer issues and water issues from Flint, Michigan. We spent no money there, but we're going to put it on roads that create literally zero jobs. And if the argument from Senator Kavanaugh is that they didn't spend the money in HHS, so we should sweep it, then why are we giving more money to NDOT? They have not spent all their money. So I have some work that I have to get done. I have to get some deadline is tomorrow on it. So I'm going to let others do some talking. But when it gets kind of quiet, we're going to have some Q&As. And you're going to have to stand by what we're doing and what you voted on, unless you do what half of my committee did and decide to switch votes. I'm okay with that too, because that's your prerogative. I'm cool with that. But we're going to have to justify it, because your commitment for when I got up here and kept filibustering and taking my time on 1014 2 years ago, 3 years ago almost now, saying you can't spend all these ARPA funds. The deal was the catch-all, anything not spent was going back there. So when you voted to transfer money, and particularly ARPA
Senator.
money, you are voting against East Omaha. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Wayne. Senator Wishart, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in support of LB 412 and against the motion to indefinitely postpone this budget bill. I also want to thank Chairman Clements and the rest of the committee and the fiscal staff for their work on this deficit budget. This is my last deficit budget that I get the opportunity to work on, and it has been an absolute honor to work on the Appropriations Committee over the last 8 years. It has definitely been a roller coaster of experience in terms of our fiscal situation, having come in as a freshman senator with us deep in the red as a state, and us working to pull ourselves out of that, and then being in a much better fiscal situation today and moving forward. I want to remind everyone this is a deficit budget. Our full biennial budget we passed last year, and so the way I look at this is the additional tweaks that we would like to see based off of sort of a main vision that we had last year in terms of our biennial budget. Some of the areas that we continue to prioritize in this are water. Education funding, as the chairman discussed, there was an increase from what we had anticipated TIOSA to cost, and we were able to meet that in our budget and make sure that we're fully funding our public schools. We prioritized rural fire departments infrastructure. It is a bill that Senator Brewer and Senator Ballard, as well as Senator Dover brought. I thought it was one of the more compelling hearings that have been in front of Appropriations Committee. It is a drop in the bucket, $2 million, from what we need to do to support rural fire infrastructure in our state. But I'm glad to have been part of a group that continues to invest in this over the years. And I hope moving forward, for those of you who are listening and engaged in future years, that we continue to make that investment, because it's vital for public safety in our environment across the state. I'm really proud of some of the work we did in terms of child welfare, investing in particular in foster care facility with Cedars that made it into our budget, and I think is going to be a significant improvement for foster youth in our state, recognizing that Cedars, while located in Lincoln, supports a lot of youth across the state. And then we've also invested in, for example, some nurse visitation programs. Lancaster County has just piloted a really incredible program in which a nurse visits a new mother within the first 3 weeks of having a child. And we were able to invest some additional dollars into that program so that more than Lancaster County is able to experience that important service. As has been discussed, we've prioritized infrastructure, not only water, but roads as well in this budget. Colleagues, did I get everything I wanted in this budget? No, I don't think there's ever been an appropriations year where I've gotten everything I wanted. I would have liked to see more funding towards providers, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the issues that we're dealing with in terms of why you're seeing money that's not being spent within public assistance and in behavioral health. And that is something we're going to need to fix, some structural issues that we're going to have to fix because the need is out there. And then I do hope moving forward that this body will consider the major needs that our tribes have in terms of water resources. There are some tribes that exist today in Nebraska that are literally not able to drink their own water. And I would have liked to see that included in the budget. And like I said, we win some and we lose some in our committee, and the goal is we come out and we support the budget, and that's what I intend to do. But that is something that I'm appealing to this legislature to consider moving forward. I'll get into answering some of my colleagues' questions moving forward around sort of statutory changes versus intent language, as well as why we're seeing a reduction in public assistance, and then talk a little more about behavioral health in my next time on the mic. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Wishart. Senator Vargas, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you. Okay, I stand in support of LB 1412 and in opposition to the IPP motion, although I welcome an IPP motion. It's our opportunity to actually talk about the budget, which I think is a really, really good thing. And I want to kind of approach this in a similar fashion that some of my colleagues on the committee have been talking about for a couple reasons. One, many of us have been on the committee for about 8 years, and we have been in ebbs and flows of what kind of budgets we do and do not have. But for the purpose of this, I really like talking about this as a budget adjustment, because that's exactly what it is. This is a budget adjustment. And in particular, I tend to look at Appendix A, page 44, because this is where, when people are thinking about all the general fund expenditures and everything that we do on the floor, the debate, when you look at page 44, that's the general fund appropriations adjustments. These are the minor adjustments, and they are minor in the grander scheme of the entire budget that we are making. And if you're looking at this, the largest adjustment is actually on TIOSA adjustment for education funding, which represents $94 million. In total, the committee has made about $14.9 million in 2023, 2024, and $73 million in 24, 25. But the large overwhelming majority of that net change is from TIOSA education funding. That's largely what this is in terms of the general fund obligation changes that we're making. There are other changes which we will clearly debate in terms of transfers from different other funds, which are losses and wins in different committees, and depending on which ones were moved and which ones weren't. And there are other changes in this in terms of things that were moved away from different agencies. But one of the things I wanted to make sure is, when we're talking about the general fund expenditures, we are not making new, or really a lot of new general fund expenditure than this, partly because, well, one, the ideas and different things that were brought to committee don't have enough votes for some of these really wonderful bill ideas. That's one. And without having consensus or majority of the members of the committee on general fund bills or ideas, or to put more money in other things that are important, we just couldn't get the full consensus of support on those. But what we could do is we have to fund education, additional homestead exemption, which we are required by law to make sure we're doing, which is an additional 30 million. We also had historic salary increase for State Patrol, which is about a 22.1% increase, including the funding for the State Patrol headquarters. Additional funding for child welfare aid and child welfare staff, largely because of both need for staffing and need for aid. So investments in education, investments in the Homestead Exemption Act, investments in State Patrol, investments in child welfare aid. Here's the things that we don't have in here that I wish we would have seen that we just didn't get to, get over the finish line. I personally would have wanted to see more support for provider rates, conversations I've had with Senator Dorn many a night, not only for DD or child welfare, but we're talking about for hospitals, for Medicaid providers. It's the same debate that we had on the mic last year when we were trying to override the governor. I think we need to do more, not because of just a workforce issue. This is a quality of healthcare access issue, but the votes aren't there in committee. And again, we win some and we lose some in each committee vote and in the committee process. That's what I didn't see in here, which I really wish we saw. I also wish we saw more investments in higher education affordability. I made a big fight and push for making sure that we're protecting and the investments from the lottery funds to the Opportunity Grants Program to other grant programs in higher education, because I believe that this is one of the ways that we can make sure we're making it more affordable for people to be able to enter our workforce. But overall, the reason why I look at this as a budget adjustment is there are a lot of really wonderful bills that were brought to committee. There's a lot of general fund bills that were on the floor right now. There is more money available for the floor. We did not have a lot of general fund obligations within the committee, which means the things that you're fighting for on the floor, many of the things I've supported, really, really good bills that do require a general fund obligation for staffing, have some funding available so that we're able to actually enact them and put them into our overall the ability for growing for early education or for childcare or for workforce or many of these are economic development. The bills in the other committees, there is some more money for the floor. We don't have bills in committee that are really doing a lot of general funds, nominal. Most of this, again, is education, homestead exemption, child welfare aid, State Patrol salary.
That's your
things that
time,
we're obligated.
Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Vargas. Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Senator Clements yield to a question? Would Senator Clements yield to a question?
Senator Clements, would you yield to a question?
Yes.
Thank you, Senator Clements. On page 19 of the green appropriations budget proposal, you have the cash funds listed, and the very first cash fund is the Security Acts cash fund. And I see that we're taking 15.5 million out per year for a total of 39.5 million. What is the solvency of that cash fund?
Let me look at my book just a minute. All of the cash fund transfers are shown in the gold book from the governor. And that gets funds into it every year. Look in here.
So do you know how much money is currently in that cash fund?
It's in here as soon as I get to it. Excuse me.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask more questions while you're looking for it. So the Security Act of Nebraska cash fund, we're taking 39.5 million out of it, and I'd like to know what the solvency is, but I'd also like to know what the budget is for the utilization of that cash fund, because it was established in statute 8-1120, the Administration of Act, Director of Banking and Finance Powers and Duties, Use of Information for Personal Benefit Prohibited, Security Acts cash fund created. And
Yes.
the cash fund is created to be used for enforcement.
Yes, I found it now.
Okay,
The starting balance this fiscal year is $32.9 million, and it gets revenue of about $32 million a year. This is something that has been in each year of the budget, that are transfers are taken out,
how much are they typically in past years?
about $25 million.
So
And
why are
this-
we not lowering the fees that we put into that fund for those that pay into that fund?
I don't know. We don't deal with that in my committee.
Okay.
These are extra funds that, there's an insurance fund also that transfers quite a bit to the budget every year, but
So it
it
sounds
shows
like
it's
we're
going to leave $19 million in this fund yet.
Okay, and we're taking 15.5. And so they'll be left with 4 million? Is that enough? Is that sufficient for them to operate? Has that been asked and answered?
Just a minute. Yes, their analysis, all of the cash fund transfers are leaving sustainable amounts in the ending balance, yes.
But there's no discussion over the fact that we're overcharging fees to fund these cash funds.
There's been people that have brought that. One of the excess fund is bank assessments that I pay.
Yeah.
There's excess money there, and I'm being assessed more than they need, but I don't know who needs to change that.
It sounds like we probably do. Thank you, Senator Clements. I'm going to be asking you about a lot of cash funds today. So that's just the first one. How much time do I have left?
1 minute, 23 seconds.
Thank you. So the Securities Act cash fund, I will say something that I think is really excellent that this budget brings up is how we are overcharging the people of Nebraska in fees across the board. Some of these cash funds were established for a specific purpose, and if there are millions of dollars sitting in there, what we should be doing is assessing how we can give that money back to the people who paid into it to begin with. Now, I understand taking the money now because it's sitting there, but we're not having the parallel conversation of if we're taking this money because it's sitting there, why are we not also at the same time lowering the fees in the future? We're going to continue to have our budget be balanced on the backs of fees. That doesn't make any sense to me, but I'm a liberal. What do I know about fiscal conservatism, I guess, right? I'm the one that wants to tax and spend everything. Oh, wait, that's right. I want us to lower our fees. I want us to lower our taxes for the working poor. I want us to balance our budget on good judgment and sense. I don't like pet projects.
That's your time, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh. Senator Frederickson, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon, Nebraskans. I'm listening closely to this debate. I'm actually really looking forward to this debate. There's a lot to discuss, and I appreciate the work of the Appropriations Committee. I appreciate the work of Chair Clements and Vice Chair Wishart and other members of the committee, and also appreciate that they took the time this morning to help brief us on the budget a little bit before we got into session today. But before I dive too deep into the budget itself, I want to speak a little bit about what happened in here this morning. And I spoke about this on the mic this morning. I said I was going to pay really close attention to the board, that I think us in the room should also pay attention to the board, that Nebraskans should pay attention to the board. And I did pay close attention to the board. And I think it's worth noting that we saw some very strong legislative leadership from folks like Speaker Arch, Senator Linehan. I think we saw some potential future leadership from folks like Senator Jacobson, Senator Von Gillern. We also saw 7 members of this body who voted green on the bill and red on the override, and not one of those members got on the mic to share with their constituents, to share with Nebraskans why they changed their mind. That's embarrassing. We're state senators. You represented yourself one way for 3 rounds of debate. You flipped after being called by the executive branch. And you didn't even speak about that. If you're going to make hard choices in here, we all are going to have to make hard choices in here. Have a spine. The governor released a statement after the veto override saying that he appreciates the state senators took time to reevaluate LB 307 and took due notice of the concerns. He said, quote, "We need to invest in less harmful ways to combat drug usage and disease transmission that are in line with Nebraska values. I look forward to working with state senators on those strategies next session." He's exactly right. I look forward to working on that this session. Let's start with the budget. $30 million of cuts in behavioral health. What's going on? I have yet to get a good reason why we're having $30 million in cuts in behavioral health. Anyone who works in behavioral health knows that those are not excess funds that cannot be used. We need to ask ourselves, why are these funds not being used? I'm being told that those funds have not been spent, that they've just been sitting there. But from what I understand, as someone who works in the field, is that the Division of Behavioral Health is slow walking the approval process. Some of these taking over a year. I have an Excel sheet that's showing the difference of time of approval, which from what I understand used to be a very quick process, now being slow walked. So it's easy to say that funds are not being spent if we're slow walking and intentionally not spending the funds. But it's disingenuous to stand here and say that we have a behavioral health crisis and that we have $30 million of excess funds for behavioral health care. That's just not based in reality. I'm appreciative of the members of the Appropriations Committee who are here on the floor and who are willing to answer questions.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. My hope is that as we continue to debate the budget, that all members of that committee will be here on the floor. There are a lot of questions, as been highlighted by some of my colleagues, and I look forward to participating in those questions throughout the rest of the day. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Frederickson. Senator Hansen, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do have a couple questions on the budget in particular, a few things here. I was hoping Senator Armendariz would yield to a question.
Senator Armendariz, would you yield to some questions?
Yes.
One of the questions I had was the money that the $5 million, I believe, from ARPA, and then $10 million were taken from cash reserve funds to help fund the HVAC system for Madonna. I was hoping you could expound on that a little bit and explain just for a minute, because I have a couple other questions about why we're doing that, and then the purpose of it, and how we came about with the proposal in the first place.
Yes, my understanding is Madonna has a contract with state to take care of 89 critically ill patients, many on ventilators that will never be removed from ventilators. They have a contract at a reduced cost, even from the Medicaid payments, and have agreed to that at a loss every year. State also came in and evaluated their building and said that their HVAC needed to be replaced, repaired at a cost of $30 million. This created a big issue for Madonna. Much of their shortcoming from the Medicaid patients comes from private payers. They don't have it at the extent of $30 million. So the state was asked to come in and help pay for those needed repairs that the state required them to do. And they agreed to half of those repairs, which Madonna is happy with.
Okay. Do you know, are we funding any other, because I believe it's a private company, are we funding any other businesses to help take care of any infrastructure costs such as this in the budget?
No, the state needed to make a decision. The decision was this facility would close down, and their 89 patients, the state's 89 patients would then need to be dispersed throughout the state. State would make a decision, do we want to keep them intact at this facility, or do we want to disperse them throughout the state, possibly risking their health?
Okay. Madonna said they would close down if we didn't do this?
They said they could.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I might touch on that again a little bit later, but for now, I had another question. I think if Senator McDonald's around, I should have told him beforehand. Or if somebody in front of appropriations can answer the question that I've gotten a couple of questions about the rainwater study. Senator Clements, will you yield to a question, please?
Senator Clements, would you yield to some questions?
Yes.
Can you discuss that? I believe it's about 330,000-ish, I think, to study the collection of rainwater. Do you know what that's about? Can you discuss that for a second?
I do. That was a bill from Senator McDonald about a man who's doing some research at the university, and Senator McDonald is coming now. But it was requesting general funds. We did not approve general funds, but we approved ARPA funds, and Senator McDonald might be able to tell you more.
Would Senator McDonald yield to a question, please?
Senator McDonald, will you yield to some questions?
Yes.
I was asking Senator Clements about the rainwater study. I just have been having some questions about that, maybe because people are unfamiliar with it. So could you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, Senator Clements first, when he just started stating that, originally the bill was from general funds, as we discussed it, had to do with completing a rainwater study. Can we take rainwater? It's being done on UNO's campus, currently near the baseball stadium. They've spent about 4 years on this. They've raised about $350,000. That was about half of what they needed. But can we take rainwater and turn it into potable water? That's part of the study, amongst other things. But we were focusing on the water. Therefore, we decided as appropriations to take those dollars out of ARPA money instead of the general fund, one-time spend for $350,000 to complete that 4-year-long project they've been working on.
1 minute.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Hansen. Senator Dorn, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor. I too, like some of the other Appropriations Committee, I want to thank all the members of the Appropriations Committee for all the hard work they did on this budget and how we worked through, I call it, many of the issues. We had 60 bills, or 59 or 60 bills, I believe, in committee, so we heard all those. Just so people understand a little bit what we do in the second year of this budget, the readjustments or whatever, it's just like the first year. Every agency gets to make September and then finalize them December, get them to the legislature and the governor. There are changes that they're looking at for this budget. Some of them are requesting that they now don't need some funds, and some of them, there's been changes in the last year. They now need some funds or whatever. So we look at all of those. We did go through all of the agencies again, any of their adjustments that they wanted to make. We went through each of those, invited the agencies all back. Anyone that wanted to, they could come back and discuss what they were. Many of those same agencies at that same time, we talked to them about some of the governor's requests. The governor's request to, I call it, pull back some funding, or what he had in there maybe for some appropriations for him or whatever. So that was our opportunity to talk to those agencies for how that fit them, how, if they were okay with that. We held up specifically the first 2 months of the budget until we got towards the end on some of these requests so that we could actually hear from those agencies whether they were okay with it, whether they thought, no, that wasn't something that they could be a part of or whatever. I did ask, Senator Wayne brought up the fact that in our previous budget, ARPA funds were at one time, they were going to go for any extra ones. We're going to go to the North Omaha project. That I did ask the fiscal staff, Keisha over here, and that was intent language. Just so everybody's aware also, though, that North Omaha project now not being funded with ARPA funds. Last year, Senator Wayne and them came back, Senator McKinney, and now we have that as general funds, and those ARPA funds went to, I call it the city of Lincoln. Senator Wishart worked hard on that to get those ARPA funds for water projects for the city of Lincoln. When we started the budget process, we were going to use $50 million in general funds for some of those here in Lincoln, of those $180 million, but Lincoln came back to us and guaranteed us that they now would use those ARPA funds to fully utilize all $180 million, so we didn't need to put general funds in there. One of the other things I wanted to really talk about was on page 5, and that's our general fund financial status. I hope people have taken a good hard look at that list. Basically, the sheet that we're going to see out here on the floor once we pass the budget or when we pass the budget and we start talking about appropriation bills. And on line 25, because of, I call it line 13 is our general fund revenues. Some of those are actual revenues. Farther out years, those are projected revenues. And the same way with general fund appropriations, those are plugged in numbers of what is going to be appropriated. But you need to look at fiscal year 24-25. We have 574 million, and I've heard some comment about we have all that money coming to the floor, 574 million above the minimum reserve. Well, no, we don't. And that's what I wanted to make sure people understood. You also need to look at that next column 2 years over there. If our revenue meets these projections and our appropriations or what we spend meets these projections, 2 years out there, we're only at 68 million. I want to caution people, if in 24-25, if we appropriate something on the floor here for $10 million, if some bill is $10 million, it will reduce, thank you, it will reduce that 574 million by 10 million. But what it also does, you have to count each of those next 2 years, 10 million. So that reduces that 68 million by 20 million. This body needs to decide if they're comfortable with that number out there 2 years out being a negative number or being zero, or where they're comfortable with, because right now that is 68 million, which basically tells us we don't get to spend a lot on the floor. Thank you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor.
Thank you, Senator Dorn. Senator Walls, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I have to start out by saying, Senator Lowe, it's very hard for me to distinguish your shirt from the words on the board today. And the budget book, right. I'm getting up today just to echo what Senator Frederickson has said. Behavioral health is really one of the most important factors for our youth success today in the state. And I'd like to share some statistics with you. Over a fourth, 257,000 Nebraskans have a mental health condition, with 62,000 of those having a serious mental health condition. In February 2021, 33.8% of adults reported symptoms of anxiety and depression, and 21%, colleagues, and 21% were unable to receive counseling or therapy. I'm having a hard time understanding why we're cutting behavioral health services. 22,000 Nebraskans between the age of 12 and 17 have depression. High school students with depression are 2 times more likely to drop out of school than their peers. 7 in 10 youth in the juvenile justice system have a mental health condition. 19% of students considered suicide, with 25% of those being girls. More than 1/3 of the Nebraska students felt hopeless almost every day for 2 weeks or more in the past year. That's an increase of 21% since 2010. 60% of Nebraskans ages 12 to 17 who have depression did not receive care in the last year. Colleagues, again, 60%, 60. And we want to take the funds away from behavioral health. Those statistics alone should tell you that there is a huge need. There is a long, long waiting list of people who need these services. So it's highly disappointing to see that the budget is removing $15 million in behavioral health funding. And it's especially disappointing when you dig a little further into why this money hasn't been spent. And it seems to come back to a few factors. Right now, the behavioral health regions say that the requests for approval of new programs are being slow walked by the state, taking 500 days or longer, which is actually showing an artificial surplus in the budget. And in addition, some of those approved programs are still trying to get off the ground, and those funds have not been expended yet. I had a quick conversation with behavioral health and DHHS out in the lobby. And it's obvious that there's a disagreement on why that money isn't being spent. But bottom line for me is I don't really care who's dropping the ball or whose fault it is. I care about the Nebraskans who need the services, who are waiting in crisis situations for services. If it's a process problem, we need to get it fixed. All that being said, the need for mental health services is on the rise across our nation and here in Nebraska. I've asked Senator Wishart about the idea of
1 minute.
shifting these funds to the regional centers. And if that's the case, I don't know if it is for sure, that implies that we're giving up on providing people with services that are just waiting, and we're just waiting for them to commit an offense that lines them in a regional center. I don't agree with the fact that people should have to commit an offense to receive mental health. I believe in prevention. Nebraskans deserve a chance to better themselves. So I ask that you please do not allow the $15 million to be cut from behavioral health services. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Walls. Senator Halloran announces guests in the north balcony, 40 fourth graders from Adams Central and Hastings. Please stand and be recognized by your Nebraska Legislature. Senator Clemens, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. A number of issues have been raised, and I'm going to try to address a few of them. First one being the behavioral health. The gold book that we received from the governor and his proposal on page 23, it talks about the behavioral health aid reduction. The recommendation includes the agency requested general fund appropriation decrease of $15 million in fiscal year 23-24 and 24-25 in behavioral health aid to more accurately reflect historical and future spending without reducing services. So the agency made this request and are saying to us that their services are still going to be provided. And one reason for the extra funds is that Medicaid expansion added behavioral health services for thousands of people who previously had no insurance for behavioral health treatment and are now able to get that treatment under the Medicaid. So the Medicaid expenses are going up for behavioral health. And so the behavioral health direct aid without Medicaid had excess money. And that's would be my explanation for that. And I think the issue is that the behavioral health providers are wanting to spend the excess dollars for new programs that haven't been in effect before. And I think it's, I kind of would agree with Senator Wayne on this one. A new program that they want to expand should be in a different committee and not in appropriations. Then another one regarding the fund transfers, we'll be talking about fund transfers. LB 1413 will be really where the fund transfers are, so I'm going to delay talking about those there. Regarding referencing of bills, Senator Wayne, it's recommended by the bill drafters and based on historic assignments. And there have been times when I requested bills that were directed to appropriations to send them to other committees when I saw that it was a new program that I hadn't seen before. And so I do try to watch out for that. Then as far as being able to spend, how much money do we have to spend? The 2023 budget allocated all of the economic forecast revenues that were expected. We budget based on the Economic Forecast Committee. And the forecast February 29th went up $50 million, not leaving that much room for new spending because the base amount, the money other than that had already been allocated in last year's budget. So you'll see that on page 44 of the Green Book that general fund spending is increased by $88 million. And that's more than the $50 million, but that's because some of these excess cash funds are being transferred in that will cover that excess spending. Then regarding unused ARPA funds going to East Omaha, that was intent language, which was in the prior budget that ended June 30th, 2023, and expired with that budget.
1 minute.
Thank you. On page 38 of the Green Book, you'll see that East Omaha transferred $178 million of ARPA funds, and it went over to the city of Lincoln in exchange for cash reserve funds because it was unsure whether the East Omaha project could really utilize all of those ARPA funds. So I am not glad to take more questions, but I will take more questions if people have them. It is a complicated process, and I appreciate all the conversation. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Clemens. Senator Conrad, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, colleagues. I agree with Senator Clemens that there is a significant process involved in constructing the budget, but I will tell you that you don't need to be a budget expert to know that this budget is wrong. It divorces itself from an economic reality. It steals money from vulnerable Nebraskans, including those with behavioral health issues and the poorest of the poor. And it utilizes and relies upon budget trickery at a time of economic prosperity. And it is not sustainable now and or moving forward. So I want to talk about a few global notes on process, then I want to make good on my word to start asking Appropriations Committee members some specific questions about specific aspects. But here's what's important to know, colleagues. Nebraska, of course, has a balanced budget requirement in our state constitution. So thankfully, we are bound to be good fiscal stewards and not get into trouble with debt and overspending in Nebraska like we see in our sister states and on the federal level. But even in the first part of a budget year, the first session of a biennium, you're still only seeing, a quintessential iceberg, maybe 10% of the budget that's relevant to kind of give or take back and forth as part of the budget process and deliberations. And you're seeing less of that during the second year of the biennium, during a budget adjustment period. That's because Nebraska does not engage in zero-based budgeting. So you're only reacting from an Appropriations Committee perspective, for the most part, either to rubber stamp what the governor has put forward or to make some slight adjustments. But so don't forget for 1 second, and you can go and look at the State Legislator's Guide to State Agencies, in addition to the specific programs and dollars amount that we're talking about in the budget bills that are presented as a package as per their typical process, there's a huge amount of budgetary authority, huge staffs, huge amount of plethora of programs in each of the, well over 80 state agencies that are out there. And we're only talking really about a small sliver of those, and even a smaller sliver in the mid-biennium budget adjustment year. So the other thing that's important to know about that is that this does not need to pass. Unlike the fact when we put forward the biennial budget in the first session, that has to go. That's the constitutional obligation. That's the most important part of our work. The budget adjustments in the second year are basically nice to have but not necessary from a constitutional perspective, from a legal perspective. The one tiny asterisk or caveat in regards to this particular proposal may come with time-sensitive things on unallocated, unutilized, or underutilized ARPA funds, which we're going to need to move out a little bit more quickly in some instances. But on the whole, there's nothing in this budget that we need to move. And I thank Senator Wishart for being really honest about where we are with this budget in her previous remarks. We're not even making sure our tribal neighbors have water that they can drink. And we're playing games and we're using baling wire and bubble gum to construct a budget to pay for unsustainable, arbitrary property tax relief, period, and to prop up the tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires and big corporations that y'all put into effect last year. So let's not kid ourselves with what's going on here. This budget is a mess. And it should not be advanced. And we're going to take a lot of time talking about line items and talking about programs, and we're going to see who did their homework and who did not. And we're going to see what's defensible and what's not. And we're going to make sure that we have the time for that debate. And the good news is, if this doesn't move, it's not the end of the world. It's not required from a legal perspective. So there is no pressure to push this budget adjustment forward. It is just that. It is just an adjustment. I contend with what's before us in this proposal. It is not thoughtful. It is not sustainable. We'd be better off just coasting on the budget that we passed last year than slashing and burning and sweeping with this budget. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Conrad. Senator McDonald, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Conrad's correct. This is mid-biennium budget. If we took no action, would we continue to have a budget in place? Yes, definitely. Now, the process we went through in my time here, that has never happened. Based on the idea of the process that we go through, where the bills are brought to us, well, first when the governor proposes, and then we start deposing, but then all of a sudden there's all the senators here that have brought bills, introduced bills that were assigned to appropriations. So we start through that process and going through that and building a budget. Now, again, we are unified as Appropriations Committee on LB 1412. I don't want you to think that there wasn't discussions and disagreements and good debate during that process. And I think Senator Clements did a good job trying to keep it fair. And I think everyone on the other members of appropriations were always trying to be fair and listen. And so it is a professional atmosphere, but it's not an easy process. For our bills that we potentially could bring, our feelings, the discussions, our positions we have, and on other bills that the senators brought. But as we go through this process and going back to 2017, Senator Clements, Senator Wishart, Senator Vargas is our first year on appropriations. We had $1 billion problem. And so we went through the process and we looked at making tough decisions. And I believe at that time the speaker put out that anything with a fiscal note of $5,000 or more would not be scheduled on the floor. So that's what kind of decisions we were making and problem solving. We were trying to come up with solutions for those kind of problems. But just to let you know where we are today, and I'll hand this out, and I handed it out early in the year, but I didn't have the year-end 12/31/23 from the Nebraska Investment Council's annual report. So in the end of 2017, we had a total of $27 billion across 34 investment programs. One of those was our operating investment pool was at $3.6 billion. Today, well, I should say that today, it's even higher than this, but right now it's December 31st of 23. The report shows that our operating investment pool is at $9.9 billion. That's our state's checkbook. And we're at $40 billion. So compared to where we were in 17 at the end of the year, total Council oversees 27 billion. They're overseeing 40.8 billion, and in our operating investment pool, and it's broke down. So there's more to it than just what I'm reading, but I want you to have a flavor of where we are, what a great job the Investment Council has done, what we've done as the former governor, the current governor, the appropriations, all of you as state senators that have served in the past and are currently serving where we are in our financial health. So I want to make sure that you have that in front of you as we go through the appropriations mid-biennium adjustments and have those discussions. I would yield the remainder of my time to Senator Clements if he needs it. No? Okay, Senator Clements at this time does not. So what I want to do is make sure that during this process, again, this is the budget for the state of Nebraska, and however many hours that the members of this body feel necessary to talk and have that discussion and answer your questions, either on the mic or off the mic. I know all 9 of us as Appropriations Committee members are here to talk to you on the mic, off the mic, during the evening hours, early morning. We're available to have those discussions. So I appreciate so far the conversation on the floor. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator McDonald. Senator McKinney, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise against the budget in support of the motion to indefinitely postpone for multiple reasons. I know we've heard the conversations that federal funds were transferred into state dollars, and for whatever reason, there's an assumption that those federal funds should not have been transferred to the Economic Contingency Fund. I would refer the Appropriations Committee, anybody that's interested, to the statutes 81-12-244. It says in this, it's in statute, it's not just intent language, that the legislature, that any unobligated amount as of July 1, 2024, the funds shall be allocated to the contingency fund. It also has language that says the state treasurer shall transfer any interest earned after April 19, 2022 to the economic contingency fund. So where's the interest? How much is it? And how much it has been transferred to the economic contingency fund that you guys are trying to transfer to other places? I would like those answers, because it's not just intent language. Then I have other questions. I'm just very curious of why the Rural Workforce Housing Fund is getting $20 million, but the Middle Income Workforce Housing Fund is only getting $5 million. That doesn't seem equitable to me. So when somebody from appropriations gets back on the mic, I would like those answers. Have you actually read the statutes pertaining to the transfers? And 2, why is the Rural Workforce Housing Fund getting $20 million and the Middle Income Workforce Housing Fund is only getting $5? That doesn't seem equitable. If there's an affordable housing crisis in the state of Nebraska, it's not just in rural Nebraska. If we're allocating dollars, it should be close to equal as possible. And right now, it's not close to equal at all. So I would like to understand your reasoning. So will Senator Clements yield to a question?
Senator Clements, would you yield to some questions?
Yes.
Why is the Rural Workforce Housing Fund getting $20 million and the Middle Income Workforce Housing Fund only getting $5?
That was reviewed in committee. Actually, the proposal was to not give middle income any, was to put 25 million in rural, and there was a compromise in committee to change it from 0 to 5 million and leave 20 million to the rural.
Does that seem like an equitable compromise when 20 million is going to rural and only 5 is going to middle and urban?
I'm not sure what the funding is for the middle.
It's 5 million in Section 8, and there's 20 million in Section 7 for rural.
Yeah,
My question is that your belief that that is an equitable distribution of the resources? How is 20 going to rural and only 5 going to middle?
the question is really, what is the current balance in each fund? And I don't have that at my hands. That's additional money. There is still other money with middle, and we'd have to ask the fiscal office to.
But regardless of the balances in each fund, why is one getting a substantial amount more than the other?
1 minute.
When affordable housing is supposed to be a crisis for the whole state.
That I've answered the question. That's all I know at this point.
And lastly, have you read the statutes on the funds transfers for the ARPA funds?
Yes.
So you would see that it's in statute. It's not just intent language, right?
The word intent, it starts with what I read from LB 1024 previously.
But the transfer is supposed to happen to the Economic Contingency Fund, and we made no agreements that shouldn't happen last year. But I appreciate your conversation. I think we're running out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Senators Kinney and Clemens. Senator John Kavanaugh, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, I guess I rise in support of the IPP at the moment, and I stand in support of the IPP because I have yet to be convinced that the budget is necessary to be adopted. I do have a lot of thoughts about it, and I know there's a lot of folks in the queue, and I do think there's been a really good conversation. I appreciate comments from Senator Conrad, the other Senator Kavanaugh, Senators Wishart and Walz, and Senator Vargas, and Senator Wayne, and Senator McKinney. The conversation Senator McKinney was just having with Chairman Clements about this, and it makes me think of the conversation we had this morning about overriding a veto, and I know a lot of folks have expressed feelings on that, but that particular conversation made me think of a veto override from last year where the Appropriations Committee put in the budget $10 million each for rural workforce housing and $10 million for middle income housing, and that was vetoed. The Appropriations Committee voted split decision to put that out as a veto override, and then we took it up on the floor, and I know several members of the Appropriations Committee did not vote to override that veto, and maybe they could explain what's changed since last year, is why we need to. Last year, we didn't need to put $10 million into rural workforce housing, and this year, to Senator McKinney's point, we need to put 20 million, I think he said it was, 20 million into rural workforce housing, which again, I supported the veto override last year. I supported putting that money into workforce housing because, as Senator McKinney correctly pointed out, housing affordability is a huge issue facing people of Nebraska. And that issue is true whether you live in a rural area or in a urban area. So I think that's an interesting point, but I guess to go back to the point about the governor is not infallible. We don't do things just because the governor asks us to. And I do feel, Senator Clements, that often, all too often, your justification, stated justification for actions that this body takes is because the governor asked us to. You said that in the briefing this morning. Why are we putting, I think it was the money, $5 million, was because the governor suggested it, was I think the exact wording. Governor suggested it. There was a separate bill that had been taken up in a committee last year that didn't go anywhere, that would have given the statutory authority for that grant. But when asked why it was put in the budget this year, is because the governor suggested that it might be. We had folks who voted for Senator Hunt's bill this morning, or voted for it previously and then didn't vote for it today because the governor asked folks to. We are a separate body of government who has our own charge and responsibilities and obligations and our own dignity separate from that branch of government and should act as such. And this is one example where the governor decided last year that we did not need more money for rural workforce housing. And at different times, at least once to me, was articulated that we didn't need more money because it couldn't be spent, which is another justification we're hearing for a lot of these other things. Money couldn't be spent. So what has changed since last year? That now rural workforce housing the solution is twice as much money as was vetoed last year. Was the governor wrong? Were those who voted not or voted to sustain that veto wrong last year? Should we have listened to our own decision-making process and actually overridden that veto and put that money into rural workforce housing? And then we'd be standing here having a conversation about whether we should put another 10 million in as opposed to 20 million. Thank you, Mr. President. So I've got other things to say about the budget, and I'll push my light again to talk about it. But I appreciate the conversation that everybody's making, but I would just highlight that for everybody. Think about this on a case-by-case basis with your own judgment and perspective that you were invested with, that you were placed here by your constituents to exercise, and make a determination, because the governor is one person, he is fallible. We are standing here having a conversation about one of the mistakes that he made in the veto last year, and is being asked to be integrated into this budget that, as several people have correctly pointed out, we are not obligated to pass. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh. Senator Hunt, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was just fully shaking because of this heated conversation I had with Senator Mike Moser. And I walked over to Senator Conrad and I was like, hold my hand for a minute, like calm me down for a second. One of my favorite tweets, I'm a Twitter user, is from Cher, who is an iconic Taurus. And she has this tweet that says, okay, the rant is over, I'm calm. Well, I'm not calm, I just got so upset I tired myself out. And that's how I feel a lot of the time in this body. None of the people who flipped their vote on that veto, I'm going to talk about the veto. None of the people who flipped their vote on that veto override have insulted me by coming up to me and telling me why, or embarrassed themselves by coming up to me and telling me what happened over the weekend to change the policy, to change the impact of the law, to reveal some revelatory new information that made them realize that they were wrong 3 times to vote for it, but now that the governor doesn't like it, they've got themselves together and they're going to do the right thing. And I hope that none of you do. I've heard that some of you have talked to my other colleagues about why you changed your vote, hoping it would get back to me. And that's called a back channel. That's when maybe you have tension or strife with someone and you don't want to directly go up and talk to them, like I did with Senator Moser when I was working on my veto override votes. I had a mutual friend that we have, former State Senator Paul Shoemaker, who's a mutual friend of us both, talked to Senator Moser about the merits of the bill. That was a back channel because Senator Moser and I have had tension in the past that I felt last week could not be surmounted to the point where we could have a productive conversation about the veto. But that does not mean the policy's wrong. That doesn't mean the bill is bad. That doesn't mean it doesn't deserve to pass. It's just politics and it's a method of communication. It's not the same thing as outside influence. You know, I know Speaker Arch talked to many of you, just as Governor Pillen talked to many of you. Doctors from the NMA, from UNMC, Chancellor Jeff Gold talked to many of you. Dr. Ali Khan talked to many of you. Your, public health departments talked to you. These are sometimes back channels to avoid a face-to-face conversation, not just with me, but maybe others. And it's lobbying, it's working a bill. It's not quote unquote outside influence. It's not what that is. But I would like anybody who flipped their vote for that veto override to prove that the governor didn't influence you, prove he didn't call you, prove he didn't promise something for you. You know what? You know what my eagle eye has seen? I've seen some amendments get filed on things in the last week by people who flipped their vote. And we're going to examine what those amendments do and see if we suddenly have a lot of support for those kinds of things. Wastewater treatment facilities for your districts, things like that. What you're going to learn in the legislature is that we can have it all. We can have both. Yes, we could have overridden the veto and you can still get your wastewater, whatever. Yes, we can override a veto and you can still get things that you want. Senator Moser said that I have trouble in here because I can't talk to anybody. Nobody wants to talk to me, etc. I did say that last year. I said I didn't want to talk to anybody. But I would defy any of you.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. To name anything that's happened to you in this body as a professional, as a qualified professional person that rose to the level of personal attack that I experienced last year. Like, please. You know, I think that my reaction was understandable. Not great, but it's not that I'm not proud of it, because I think I did my best, and I think I've done a great job this year. What was my point? I did have a different point. I guess the point is just, it was a clearly personal vote. I clearly can get along with people. I mean, why do I have Halloran and Erdman voting with me? Because they listen to me, because they keep their word, because when they understand a policy, they go, makes sense, okay.
That's your time, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Hunt. Senator Wisher, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, just to answer a couple of questions that came up today. First of all, in terms of public assistance, I know Senator Kavanaugh talked about this and the fact that we are sort of underutilizing what we estimated our public assistance needs would be. That's an aid program. And so we estimate as a committee and as a legislature what we anticipate the needs will be. And then in some years that comes in under. Generally speaking, we tend to try to overestimate, and so it did come in under this year. What I will say is that one way that we could address sort of underutilization is if this body were to bring a piece of legislation that increased the sort of who could participate in these public assistance funds. That's something I would be interested in. Although I'm not going to be able to vote on that legislation, as this is my last year. But that's an example, colleagues, of something where, as an appropriations committee, we are reacting to the reality of what the aid need is. And if the legislature wants to prioritize people in need by expanding the pool of people who can access those funds and utilizing more of those funds, then we would need to do that through a bill. The other area I wanted to talk about was behavioral health. You know, I've talked about this in my previous time at the mic. This is something where I would have liked to see this funding remain in the budget. I think one of the issues that we're dealing with in terms of behavioral health is that if we're not able to pay staff members, frontline staff members, the type of salary that they can have a quality of life, a sustainable life, then you're not going to have enough people in those professions and fields to be able to provide the services to people in need. I share with what Senator Wall said. When you hear from communities, you hear about increasing need for mental health and behavioral health support, whether it be because of mental illness, whether it be because of substance abuse. And so it is concerning to me that we are not seeing sort of full utilization and increased utilization of these funds. And I think one area that has to be addressed is getting the salaries up to the level that makes this a profession that someone can go in and live sustainably in their life. Because it's a challenging job for people to do, and it is one that is so important. And so that is something that I think moving forward we need to look at in terms of legislation and prioritization. I did want to talk a little bit about some of the discussion around sort of statutory versus intent language. What I will say, colleagues, is that we actually, as an appropriation committee, are very diligent about working to not include what we would consider major statutory changes in our budget. That's why when you look at a lot of the bills and in the changes that you're seeing in this deficit budget, for the most part, it's intent language. It is not a full statutory change. And in fact, when there was pieces of legislation that we felt was creating a robust new program and came to our committee, but we felt needed to stand on its own on the floor, then we voted those bills out separately, and we did not include them in the budget.
1 minute.
I did want to answer one other question. I think it was Senator McKinney who asked in terms of the amount of interest that we've transferred over into the East Omaha investment. It's 22 million was last year. We estimate it'll be 22 million this year, and then another 20 plus million next year. So for a total of a little bit over 60 million that we anticipate will be transferred over in interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Wishart. Senator Vargas, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you very much. So a couple of things I wanted to make sure to touch on. First, I just want to thank the fiscal office for putting up with us, in particular for putting up for us with those of us that have been here for 8 years. I don't like the many head nods after I said putting up with us that just happened on the side, actually, now that I'm seeing it. But I really do appreciate the fiscal office for everything that they do. It's not... We ask a lot of them over the years. I think of the very reactiveness of digging in, and even just now for trying to answer questions for some of my colleagues. So I just wanted to say thank you. We appreciate you very, very much. And to my colleagues, I've been trying to get some questions to answers to different questions that are very sort of structural or technical in nature. But I do want to come back to just like the really high level, which is as a biennium budget adjustment, I think it's page 44, that provides the biggest snapshot to what big changes we are making, which is not a lot of big changes, and a lot of this is a statutory obligation to funding TIOSA, and that additional funding that's going to TIOSA that we have to make sure we're making up, the homestead exemption, the additional funding for homestead exemption, the additional funding that we are making sure to put towards a couple of other different aid, specifically for child welfare aid, and some of the staffing within DHHS. And I know, and I mentioned, and I had this conversation with Senator McKinney, if it was up to me completely, I would have probably had a 50-50 on the housing funds. Everybody knows, or at least I hope you know, housing has been important to me. I care deeply about the rural workforce housing and the middle income workforce housing and housing in general, because we have a housing shortage. We have very few housing stock. There just wasn't enough votes. Clemens would probably be frank with you about this. There wasn't enough votes in committee to do the full 50-50 equity or even equitable in some way, shape, or form. And that's the reason why it is the numbers that we currently have. But both of these programs are overextended, are almost completely out of funds. I think the last I heard is even the middle income only has like $1 to $2 million left. So adding this $5 million will ensure that there's another round of housing programs. And if we didn't fund the rural workforce housing, again, we also wouldn't have enough funds because they've also exhausted pretty much most of their funds to programs across the state or to projects across the state. A couple of other things I wanted to make sure to just flag, and I mentioned this earlier, every single time that we have transferred funds, whether you agree with it or not, the funds aren't going to tax relief. They're going to the floor. They're going to what we find in consensus that we agree with here, which means that every bill that we are supporting that has a general fund impact, or that has an A bill, or has a revenue loss in the future, or offsets, really, when we were having these discussions, the rationale might be from the governor's office, and we heard that many times, that this is for tax relief. It is up to us on the floor on whether or not the funds that are currently available for the floor is truly for tax relief, and whatever the other projects or bills that are passed on the floor that have a general fund impact. I just wanted to clarify that because that was part of the conversation that we had. And the other part of the conversation we had was looking into the looking into the out years. We found ourselves realizing that we have to make sure that we are not having too many new general fund obligations, because if we do have a lot more general fund obligations or more lost revenue, we're going to be in even more of a dire straits in the future here. And so part of the proposal, even with the new cash fund transfers, the $575 million surplus for the current biennium falls to $69 million for FY27. So we are trying to be mindful, or at least I'm trying to be mindful. I can speak for myself, and I look to the Future Appropriations Committee and the Revenue Committee to be mindful of how much revenue we have coming in to balance what we know is only going to be $69 million in FY27. And as part of the reason why we're not seeing a lot of general fund new obligations here, and why we focused on water infrastructure, even though I agree, I wish we could have done the water infrastructure for the
That's your time,
transformations.
Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Vargas. Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, you're recognized to speak, and this is your last time before your close.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Senator Clemens yield to a question?
Senator Clemens, would you yield to some questions?
Yes.
Thank you, Senator Clements. So my first question is on page 73 of the AM, which isn't on the board yet. It's the Nebraska Capital Construction Fund, and it is 14 million, and it strikes 32,200,000 for Nebraska Capital Construction, and it is for the purchase, design, and renovation of an existing facility for the State Patrol Troop area in Omaha. Did it suddenly get cheaper to build this facility?
Yes, surprisingly so.
That is very surprising.
They located a different building or different solution, I think. I think it's a different building, and then said they weren't going to need those dollars. So yes, they did recommend a reduction.
Wow.
But they're still going to have a facility.
That's very, very surprising, but good to hear. My next question is about the base reduction of public assistance. So you're reducing public assistance by, is it 30 million over the biennium?
That's, I think you're talking about the behavioral health.
No, I'm talking about the base reduction on page 44 of the Green Book. Program 347, base reduction public assistance, says 20 million and then 10 million reduction. Well, so my
Yes, yep, I'm not familiar with what specific program that is. Sorry.
It's public assistance. So it's, well, I'll tell you, it's program 347. So it's SNAP, aid to blind and disabled, temporary assistance for needy families, community service block grants, childcare subsidies, emergency assistant, low income energy or LIHEAP, medically handicapped children, MCHIP, disabled persons and family support, social services block grant, refugee assistance, Nebraska homelessness program, Nebraska lifespan respite services program, state disability program, medical and maintenance. We are $30 million short on that. We don't need that $30 million for any of those things. I'm very concerned because this should cover a lot of different things. Like we've been told we can't afford Senator Day's bill that eliminates reimbursement for childcare subsidies based on attendance to enrollment, but we could afford it if we didn't take this public assistance money away.
I found this in the agency request, the base reduction. Spending on assistance is below the appropriated amount. The reduction of 10 million each year aligns the appropriations with post-pandemic spend patterns. And after this initial and ongoing $10 million reduction, the appropriation would be 84 million, approximately 7 million more than the average spent in recent years. So that's was the request from the agency.
Did you ask them why? That they didn't need to spend $30 million more on aid to aged, blind, and disabled? I'm pretty sure they could use that 30 million. They can always use 30 million for the disabled.
It goes on to say DHHS has requested an additional 10 million reduction in FY24 due to availability of ARPA funding, which offsets the need for these funds. The director, when he came in,
1 minute.
agreed to this item.
$10 million offsets $30 million. And we still are cutting, but we additionally are cutting funding for developmental disabilities. And this $30 million could also be used for some disabilities.
That was the 2024 item.
Okay,
the
thank you.
additional
I think
10
I'm
million.
almost out of time. I genuinely don't understand why you cut funding to behavioral health, developmental disabilities, and public assistance. And you can tell me that they said they want the reduction, but that's not a real answer. We should be more curious than this. As I said previously, I'm not a big fan of pet projects and bloated government, but there is a function of government, and public assistance is an essential function of government. So when the government comes in and tells us they don't need the money we gave them last year, I want to know
Senator.
why. I want the answers to that. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh. Senator Dover, you're recognized to speak.
Yeah, good, thank you. I just would like to show the senators here what being on appropriations means. If you're looking right here, I know that there's a lot of questions that are asked, and be quite truthful, I'm a freshman at this, and I don't know that I could answer some of the questions that are being asked of Chairman Clements. And I want to thank Chairman Clements because I think he's doing a fantastic job. There are 77 or so agencies and I don't know, over 300 programs that are funded in a variety of ways. And so I think it's easy sometimes to kind of ask tough questions and those kind of things, but excuse me, I'm a little out of breath getting this stuff up here. But I do want to say thank you, Keisha Patent and the fiscal office here. They prepare all this stuff for us, and then we get to read it and things like this. So I'm a little afraid that Senator Conrad might ask me a specific question she did last time, and I couldn't answer, so I had to refer to the chairman. But I do want to say that I'm going to miss Senator McDonald, Vargas, and Wishart. They are a great resource for us. I thank you, Senator Dorn is still there, and Senator Clements, and the other new freshmen that are with us. But we tried to keep the budget within 2%, and with the 94 million that went over in TIOSA, that put us at 3.1%. That was a TIOSA funding. We did 20 million for child welfare aid because children are the future of the state. We did 10 million for developmental disabilities because we need to care for those that are vulnerable. We did 3 million workforce development because we have major workforce needs in Nebraska. We did 20 million to roads because roadway infrastructure is a lifeblood of our state. And we did 2.4 million to volunteer fire departments. I know that's a critical issue for Senator McDonald and to his heart. And so they could have radios that actually could talk to each other. We have a situation in Norfolk where they have an automatic agreement where if Norfolk's out on a big fire, Hayter has to come in. They can see each other in a fire. They can't even talk to each other. So we're trying to take care of that. Excuse me. But the Appropriations Committee is dedicated. They're hardworking. They're committed to bringing a budget that makes appropriate use of taxpayer dollars here in Nebraska. I yield the rest of my time to the chair.
Thank you, Senator Dover. Senator Erdman, you're recognized to speak.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. President. So I see Senator Dover had his notebooks there. There are significant binders that we get in appropriations. Yeah, okay. So one of the things that happens in appropriations is we have a lot of discussion. And I was visiting with Senator Wishart earlier today, and it is sometimes very difficult to determine what funds we should spend where and who has a priority. Many of the discussions this year in appropriations were dealing with the fact that the ARPA money has to be contracted for, and the contract has to be completed by the 31st of December 24. And so some of the issues that we dealt with, and rightfully so, is to make sure that we were sending the ARPA money to those divisions or agencies that could use that money and make that contract happen before the 31st, so we wouldn't have to send that money back to the federal government. So involved in that process, there were several times we had to respond to those making a request to make sure that they had the necessary contracts in place so they could spend the money. To Senator Conrad's comment this morning about we're not in a difficult financial position as we speak, I seen several issues this morning as I was watching the news. One of them was about inflation being 3.2% this year. Another one dealt with IBM has announced layoffs because the economy is not good. Gasoline prices are up again for the fourth consecutive month. It's also, there was an article that said the majority of renters say the dream of owning a home has now passed, and the prices for groceries are up again as they were last year. So we may be in a good financial position today, but going forward, we may not be. Let me give you this example. I read an article a couple of weeks ago when they analyzed farm income for 2024. And they said the net farm income for 2024 could be the largest decrease in net income in history. They are projecting agricultural net income to be down 40% in 2024 over 2023. So when you consider all of these things that are happening in the economy, it may look good today, but in the future, it may not look quite as rosy as we think it should. And so we in appropriations have tried to make decisions that will be sustainable. And we had requests from the governor to sweep some of these cash accounts. And I will just say this, the discussion in the appropriations committee was, when you take the cash remaining at the middle of a biennium, at the middle of the next biennium, guess how much cash is going to be left there? Zero. So it's my opinion that if you're going to make an adjustment to the budget, you do that when you start the budget, not in the middle of the biennium. And so when we try to sweep those cash accounts to give property tax relief or whatever issue we may find that we need the money for, it's a one-time appropriation or one-time sweep of those accounts. That won't happen again because those agencies will understand that if I have money left over in the middle of the next biennium, they're going to take it. And so we do some strange things here, and we call it balancing the budget, and we also call it property tax relief when in fact it's not sustainable. But we in the appropriations spent a lot of time discussing and negotiating where the money went. We don't take that job lightly. And I guess the word would be whining to Senator Holleran one day about appropriations and about all the issues we deal with. And he said, in a nice way, he said, shut up, you signed up for it, you volunteered. And he's exactly right. And being on appropriations has been an outstanding experience. I enjoyed serving with the people I served with on that committee, and we have had our times when we disagreed, but we also understood that we had to come with a budget. And this is the budget that we came with. And I'm still trying to figure out what the end game is of doing indefinitely postpone and some of the other issues we're talking about. Thank you for your time.
Senator Dorn, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity again. I too, I know some of the Appropriations Committee thanked the Fiscal Office. I too want to thank them. I think there's 9 or 10 of you over there, and we do lean on them a lot. We thank them very much for all the information they get us, because we do have a lot of questions when these agency heads, there's 74 agencies, by the way, when they do come in and talk about their different programs, over 270 or 280 programs, we have a lot of questions for them. We have a lot of questions of some of their proposals. There's a couple things I wanted to talk about that other people have talked about. One is Senator Conrad's right. We do not have to pass the budget this year because we can live on last year's. However, there's a couple bigger things that I see in this budget that are part of that. And I think somebody mentioned is the ARPA funds. Those all have to be allocated or said what they're going to be used for by the end of 24 here. So if we don't do some of these ARPA funds, we will be giving some of these ARPA funds back to the federal government. So I want people to be mindful of that. And the other thing is, Senator Clemens talked about it quite a bit this morning, that TIOSA funding, or basically that $94 million increase. Will that won't affect our state budget. In fact, it won't affect us at all, but some of those schools and some of that TIOSA money, as that goes out or in that formula, and those schools, those needs they have, now that won't be there. And how will they adjust their budget, or how will they line that up more, I call it, for more property taxes? Been a lot of talk this morning, or this afternoon, excuse me, about the behavioral health and all of our other public assistance and those types of things that are in this budget, or lack of that's in this budget, and taking some of those funds. One of the things that's not in this budget because it didn't come about, I have a bill 942 that was asking for a 5% and a 3% increase in the skilled nursing homes provider rates. That bill did not make it out of committee because as we went through the committee process and had discussion, and I'll really thank Senator Armendariz and some others in the governor's fiscal office staff, I have an amendment up. We're having a hearing tomorrow noon on that amendment, and that amendment for skilled nursing homes does the same thing, the same program that Senator Jacobson has brought for the hospitals, because the skilled nursing homes part has that level of care, that amount of care. They now can qualify under that same program. Does that make a difference? That makes a big difference, because this first year of that program, they will have about 20 million more. And the second year in that program, the skilled nursing home part of the nursing homes will have about 100 million plus. So we, visiting with Speaker Arch with his staff, we had to have a hearing on that because it's now not the 942 bill. It's the same subject matter. It's not that specific issue, though. We will then advance that into LB 942. I had LB 130 up on the floor on final reading a couple weeks ago. People asked me why we pulled that. This all came about during that time that we needed to pull that back. So we pulled that back to select file. Then the 942 bill now can be attached to it, because my 130 bill also does with Health and Human Services, excuse me, DHHS, and it has some language and some wordage in there for some of those types of funding proposals in the budget. So all of this process that we go through, thank everybody involved in it, that we can hopefully get that bill, that amendment passed tomorrow after we have the public hearing on that same program now as the hospitals, thank you, that we can flow that through in that same program, and it'll be a great thing for, I call it, especially the rural nursing homes. It does not affect the assisted living part of nursing homes. You won't see it in the budget book that it's being talked about in there. If you have questions, come talk to me. We'll be glad to explain it to you. But it's the same concept as what the hospital proposal is. The skilled nursing homes have that same level of care because of the requirements, and they now will qualify for the same federally funded project. Thank you very much.
Senator Blood, you are recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Fellow senators, friends all, I stand in support of the IPP motion. And Senator Erdman, I think the end game is that we just need to have, wherever you are, a good discussion about the budget, because there are so many questions that I don't think we'll be able to discuss if we don't slow it down. And I also actually agree with Senator Erdman that the property tax relief that we've been talking about a little bit is not sustainable. We're going to be stealing from Peter to pay Paul. And I feel like we've never had a sustainable property tax bill since I've been here, but that's another issue. What I want to talk about is the Water Sustainability Fund. So many other issues have already been discussed, and I don't think we've properly discussed this deficit. So we know that lakes and streams, canals, and aquifers are hydrologically connected, and they're very complex. And we know this because NRC tells us that, and that these systems are very essential to all Nebraskans. So we're talking about drinking water, irrigation, recreation, habitat for fish and wildlife. This is why statewide water planning is so important. We heard how important water is when we had the canal debate. I think it's only important when people want things. I think we forget how really important it is to sustain life in Nebraska sometimes. I know that in 2014, it was so important that the legislative body created the Water Sustainability Fund. And that same fund now is being reduced from $11 million to $2.5 million. 11 million to 2.5 million, that's a big jump. So if you look at state statute 2-1506 and you review the purpose and goals, it's about research and data, modeling, rehab or restoration of water supply infrastructure, new water supply, infrastructure maintenance, or flood prevention that protects critical infrastructure, management or storage of ground surface water, compliance with interstate compacts or federal law. Who cares about federal law? It also assists municipalities with the cost of construction, upgrading, developing, and replacing sewer infrastructure, which we know in our municipalities like Bellevue and Omaha, being some of the oldest communities in the state, that is an ongoing issue for those communities. So I started looking into it a little bit deeper. And one of the things, and we've actually written a letter from our office to the governor, I think 3-4 months ago, because it seems like a lot of these committees are missing members that should be appointed by the governor. According to the website right now, there are 3 vacancies on this committee, 1 for public power, 1 for groundwater irrigation, and 1 for range livestock owners. It seems really puzzling and a little hypocritical why we would want to take money out of this fund if there is what they consider to be surplus funding. That tells me that the committee should be handing out more funds for these purposes, because we know there have been many, many issues when it comes to groundwater and insecticides. And again, I'm not pointing fingers. I'm saying that we have funds to make these things better, but where are we investing these funds? And when it comes to all of the issues we've talked about today, where they've said, well, these departments came in and said we could do it with less money, I find it really hard to believe that they weren't directed by our executive branch or encouraged by the executive branch to bring their costs down.
1 minute.
But if they're bringing the costs down on the backs of the state's most vulnerable, on the backs of ag, on the backs of our environment, that's an issue. We don't want to waste taxpayer dollars, but we also want to use them wisely to protect taxpayers. And I don't feel that that's what this budget does. So I'm glad we're slowing it down. I'm glad we're talking about it. And I really think that someday the state needs to do a real strategic plan when it comes to financial issues and come up with a sustainable budget so we can actually attack property taxes the way it really should be.
Thank you, Senator Blood. Mr. Clerk, for some items.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your Committee on Enrollment and Review reports legislative bills 607, 839, 834, 1313, 1215, and 1200, as well as 1204, as placed on select file, some having E&R amendments. Additionally, amendment to be printed, Senator Frederickson to LB 1031. New LR, Senator Conrad, LR 319 and 320, both referred to the Executive Board. That's all I have this time, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Senator Dungan, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good afternoon, colleagues. I do rise today still considering how I'm going to vote on a number of things that are on the board, whether it's the IPP or the budget. I think it's important that we have these conversations and that we continue to discuss this back and forth. I agree with Senator Blood when she says it's really vital that we slow this down a little bit to make sure we talk about what all's in here. Last year was my first year in the legislature, and I was, I guess, a little bit surprised by virtue of the fact that when we were discussing the budget, it did not feel as though certain members in the body were able to maybe stand up and articulate why some things made it in and others didn't. Now, I understand last year was an outlier of a year, or so I'm told. And so I do appreciate the fact that we've had a number of members of the Appropriations Committee here today engaging in conversation and answering questions, because I do think there are legitimately held valid concerns that people have with regards to the way this budget is operating. And so I do thank the hard work of our friends on the Appropriations Committee to be able to back these up. But I do anticipate we're going to continue talking about this, not frivolously, but because when this budget book appears on our desks and we spend maybe a weekend reading it, there's a lot of questions that get raised because we're not a part of these conversations early on. So I would encourage my colleagues to continue listening and talking about what this all means so we can answer some of these questions. I also understand that writing a budget is difficult. I think budgeting is a thing that many of us struggle with in our day-to-day life. If my parents are watching right now, I want to say thank you to both of you for helping me work on my budgeting when I was younger. The system they set up with me was I had 3 cups. One for spending, one for saving, and one for tithing. And I would put a certain amount of my allowance into those cups every week, or I was supposed to. I sometimes struggled with that, and so it was helpful for them to keep me on track. So I know they watch the legislature from time to time, so I just want to say thank you, and I'm sorry if at times it was difficult. In addition to that, colleagues, I share and I echo the concerns that a number of my colleagues have expressed about the so-called scraping of these cash funds. It's my understanding that for time immemorial, there are certain parts of the cash funds that were in fact transferred over in these to the general funds in sort of an effort to continue to fund parts of the government. And so I know that that's not necessarily in and of itself novel. I think historically there have been cash fund transfers to the general fund from 3 major sources on an annual basis: the Securities Act Cash Fund, the Tobacco Products Administration Cash Fund, and the Department of Insurance Cash Fund. I think that in and of itself raises a question as to whether or not that structuring of the fees and the costs that ultimately send money into those cash funds is appropriate. But that's a conversation we can have another time, because I know we're not necessarily getting into that today. But my number one concern always with our budget, with our spending, with our revenue, is ensuring sustainability. And with any of these conversations, when we're talking about sustainability, there's a lot of projecting that has to happen into the future. There's a lot of calculations that go into that. But I think when we start to determine what is an appropriate use of a cash fund, what is an appropriate source of revenue, the number one concern that we should always be looking at is sustainability into the future. When I open up my budget book here, and I see that there is essentially, to put it simply, sort of a structural decrease in our excess from the minimum reserve baked into this between fiscal year 2024 and ultimately looking at fiscal year 26-27, a pretty significant reduction. That just gives me pause. It's not to say that that is the end-all be-all of how this is going to work. I certainly don't have a crystal ball. I can't predict what the future is going to show. But if we're looking at this in a mathematical and structured way, it would give me concern that we continue to potentially see a decrease, thank you, Mr. President, in the amount of money that we have statutorily required above that minimum reserve. So I want to say that to sort of just posture my concerns early on. I think we'll continue to have discussions about what is in here, what isn't in here. You may have noticed I did file an amendment on the budget, on the underlying committee amendments to 1412. Once again, we're going to be having a conversation about paying our court interpreters. The increase to the Supreme Court's the funding is not in this budget. And so our court interpreters, once again, have their pay imperiled. And I'm really concerned we're going to see a halt or a work stoppage in the courts, which is going to cause grave problems. So just forecasting a little bit of what we will get into with that, but I anticipate we'll continue to have a robust conversation. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Dungan. Senator Clemens, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do appreciate people staying here and listening and getting different parts of the budget. But so far, the only thing on the board is the bill, which the committee amendment replaces. And I'm going to go ahead and go through the committee amendment provisions since I haven't had a chance to do that yet. The committee amendment is a white copy amendment, which becomes the bill if we get to it, and adjusts the two-year budget that was passed in 2023 regarding fiscal years 24 and 25 ending June 30th of 25. The committee statement for LB 1412 has a summary of 16 bills that were adopted in here. They're listed on page 4 of your Shamrock Green budget proposal book. And I want to discuss some of those bills. LB 858 from Senator Linehan adds 1 full-time employee to the Department of Education for financial services to help with the TIOSA analysis. LB 941 from Senator Dorn adds $1.5 million in ARPA funds for assisted living Medicaid services. LB 1077 from Senator McDonald adds $900,000 in ARPA funds for workforce development and career opportunities, mostly high school age. LB 1124 and 25 from Senator Vargas and Wishart provide $1.4 million per year from the Medicaid Managed Excess Profit Fund for early intervention home visitation programs. LB 1209 from Senator Boson provides $2 million in ARPA funds to Cedars Home of Lincoln for a $3.5 million facility addition. LB 1210 from Senator Clements provides $1.5 million from the cash reserve for renovating the Capitol's 5th floor. LB 1275 and 1378 from Senators Brewer and Dover provide a total of $2.4 million from cash reserves for radio upgrades for volunteer first responders. Senator Dover already mentioned that one. LB 1281 from Senator Bostar provides $3 million from the cash reserve for the Lincoln Airport runway replacement, which is a $96 million project. LB 942 from Senator Dorn requests a 5% increase in long-term nursing care, but we're going, as he mentioned, we're going to have a hearing tomorrow and change that to an assessment provision like the hospital plan. In a new item, Madonna's long-term care facility is allocated $10 million cash reserves, $5 million ARPA. And that was discussed by Senator Armendariz for a HVAC upgrade. The balance of the ARPA funds of $20.8 million is transferred to the Department of Transportation for road projects. And if you have your green book, you can turn to page 5 where it shows the general fund status. Line 25 shows the ending balance of $574.8 million. However, the last column shows only $68.5 million. This is from slightly lower projected revenues and spending assumed a 2% each year increase of $388 million. The major expense shown on line 9 is the fund transfers out of $944 million in 2025, increasing to $976 in 2027. There's property tax credits of $395 million currently, increasing to $442 million. The Education Future Fund receives $250 million a year, and the Community College Transfer Fund is $255 million, increasing to $273. Thank you. A major change from the preliminary report is on line 18. Public school state aid from TIOSA formula increased by $94 million. And I won't, page 27 on the Green Book discusses that in detail. Then the agency changes. The Department of Revenue's homestead exemptions increased by $15 million per year. That's $30 million out of the budget. Child welfare program for foster kids needed a $20 million increase. We approved that. Regional centers needed $15 million more for staffing. We approved that. Developmental disability provider rates were increased by $10 million. And the Department of Economic Development added $2.5 million for bioeconomy. And next time on the mic, I'll finish that. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Clements. Senator Jacobson, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, again, I appreciate Senator Clements kind of getting us back into what the actual discussion topics are today. And Senator Clements, hang on, I'll yield you some time here at the end. I just want to make a couple of quick notes. This really kind of has to do more with cash transfers. As I look at page 19, my biggest concerns, I raised a couple of them this morning here in the briefing. I've got a lot of concern about State Visitors Promotion Fund, $5 million being transferred to DED. And when we had the conversation about the inheritance tax, we made an agreement there as we move that bill forward, that DED and the State Chamber would have members on the board, on the State Tourism Board. And so I don't know why we would move $5 million out of the Tourism Fund to go to DED. I think it needs to stay all with the tourism organization. So I'm going to be offering an amendment at some point to keep those funds where they're at. I would also like to speak just briefly about the State Unemployment Insurance Fund. The plan is to move $70 million. I believe there's about $77 or $78 million in that fund today. We had a big discussion about that the other day when Senator Dungan brought his bill on reducing the number of weeks of unemployment. We got into a discussion at that time about there's two funds. There's the federal fund and there's the state fund. And so I did a little more research on, okay, why do we have these two funds? Well, the fact of the matter is that the federal fund is the mandated fund, and that's the one that we pay the claims out of. And the state fund, we don't pay any claims out of. Why? Because that fund was created as a cushion for the federal fund. And as Senator Clements has said several times, that we've checked with Mr. Albin, and he's made it clear that even in a recession, we got plenty of money in the federal fund to handle a recession. So we have a cushion in there, and I get it. The governor wants to take $70 million out of there, and it is excess funds. My beef with this is then let's stop charging insurance premiums to employers. Otherwise, we're going to be right back where we were before, is we'll get another $70 million out in there and get it stolen away again. So if we're going to take the money, then let's stop funding that program. Let's figure out what's the right reserve amount, leave that in there, and then stop funding it. So I'm going to insist, if we're going to take those funds, that we sunset the dollars that are going into it and we stop charging employers for those dollars. The other concern I have would be with behavioral health. One of my first concerns when I got down there, my first bills last year had to do with our behavioral health region in the North Platte region. I'm very frustrated too. I have my concerns about there are overwhelming needs, and yet we're not getting the approvals, and hence we're getting dollars building up in the account, and now we're going to sweep the funds out. One of our biggest problems is that. I would also just mention on the State Visitors Promotions Fund, I did distribute, have handed out a sheet that was on the Nebraska Examiners. It was actually a commentary by Paul Eunice. Most people know Paul in Kearney, owns over 700 hotel units in Kearney. The only thing I would say, Paul, is shame on you for not mentioning Nebraska Land Days, but I'll let you slip on this one. But tourism is the third largest industry in the state of Nebraska, and we need to continue to support it. With that, I'm going to yield the remainder of my time to Senator Clements.
Thank you, Senator Jacobson. Senator Clemens, that's 1 minute, 10 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was just about done anyway. I was on the budget items, the new budget items, we added $2.5 million for a bioeconomy program. The governor's very excited about the opportunities we have for bioeconomy projects, and Nebraska's positioned to explode, I think, with bioscience projects. The good news on the spending part was the Office of Chief Information Officer, head of our computer system, provided computer assessment reductions of $14 million, which is credited across various agencies. I just heard we're talking about the tourism transfer from the Tourism Visitor Promotion Fund. Well, the governor has in DED a Nebraska promotion program that he is proposing which is a $5 million program.
That's your time, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Clemens. Senator Conrad, you're recognized to speak, and this is your final time on the motion.
Yes, very good. Thank you so much, Mr. President. Good afternoon, colleagues. And just so that perhaps as a refresher for all members, and particularly just a perhaps educational note for newer members, historically, whenever we start debate on the budget, we talk about the budget. And the budget is comprised of a host of different bills. Some specifically required for constitutional officer salaries, some for cash transfers, some for the main line. We have never had a rule or practice where we constrain our comments to a particular budget bill. We typically allow for wide latitude when discussing the budget as a whole, as we have been doing today. So that being said, everybody's comments are in order, of course. And of course, we're also the only deliberative body in the state, and political speech has the utmost, highest protection when it comes to free speech and free expression. So even if you weren't talking about budgetary matters, you'd probably still have a lot of latitude. But just wanted to provide that point there as well. And I'm glad that my friend Senator Dover brought out his binders today. I too am old school. I like the hard copy. I like to be able to have the binders. I like to see it in that kind of format instead of online or in the cloud. And I know that the Appropriations Committee does indeed work hard. They always do, but it is important that we note that while they were working hard, they have to be able to defend the work, and they have to be able to explain the vision that the budget supports. A budget is just like a budget at home, wherein we make investments on what we prioritize, on who we are, on what we're trying to achieve for ourselves and our families. And I haven't really heard anything about the vision other than this kind of atmospheric talk about we have to sweep funds and cut funds in order to somehow pay for property tax on the local level. So I think that's something that we need to learn and hear a little bit more about. And rather, since I'm already on my third time on the mic, and I'm not going to have time to ask all 9 members to go through, and perhaps it speaks for themselves, but I've had a chance to pull the court filings and the press releases in regards to the settlement funds that should be a subject of great debate during this budget. In essence, the Attorney General's office has built up a settlement fund in, I think, excess of about $30 million at this point in time over many years and over the course of a lot of different lawsuits that the Attorney General has brought or joined in the name of Nebraskans who have been harmed. And then through negotiating settlements with different entities have been able to bring some of those resources home. The governor proposed I think, $15 million sweep of the settlement fund. The Attorney General supported that at his budget hearing, which I had a chance to review. And then that is included in the budgetary package before us. Friends, let me be clear. There isn't a single penny that's come in from any of those settlements that came in for property tax relief. Not a penny. I didn't hear anybody ask a question about it on appropriations when I reviewed the Attorney General's budget hearing. I didn't hear the Attorney General give any sort of policy or legal basis as to why that sweep was appropriate. So I'm asking any of you, thank you, Mr. President, to tell me, when we got part of an $8 million settlement from Juul for consumer abuses, how many of those dollars were supposed to go to property taxes? When we sued Suboxone for monopoly tactics, how many of those pennies were supposed to go to property taxes? 0. When we sued CVS and Walgreens for opioids, how many of those settlement dollars were supposed to go to property taxes? 0. When we sued a leasing company for consumer protection violations, how many of those settlement dollars were supposed to go to property tax? 0. When we sued TurboTax, when we sued Facebook and Google and Blackbaud for
That's your
all
time,
different
Senator.
kinds of consumer protection violations, none of those dollars were
That's
supposed
your
to go to
time,
property
Senator.
taxes, and nobody even asked a question on the committee. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Conrad. Senator Mosier, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good afternoon, colleagues and Nebraskans. We've gotten a little bit out of the off the topic of talking about the veto override this morning, but there were some questions asked about the veto vote, so people seem to be interested in the thought process of how that all went. When we were approving the syringe program, I saw a lot of my colleagues that I respect and sometimes go to for advice and ask questions, voting for it. And I thought, maybe it's a good thing to vote. It was vote for. It was, for me, it was a close decision. And then after we gave it final approval, I had calls from the executive branch. I had calls from members of the legislature to support it or not to support it. So those were kind of a wash to me. But I had a lot of constituents tell me that they didn't like the bill because what they read into it was providing syringes for people who are addicted is not a good idea, that it's a tacit approval of their addiction. And I did vote for it the first time, but after thinking about it longer, I voted not to support the override of the veto. The queue filled up so quickly, it was pretty difficult to get in there. We only had an hour, 45 minutes, and so I didn't think anybody would be all that interested in my opinion anyway, so I just didn't enter into the discussion. But that's why we vote. Otherwise, if something got 30 votes on final reading, then that would be veto proof if there was no opportunity to vote again after that. So, it's every senator's prerogative to re-examine their conscience every time they vote and see if their opinion is still the same as it was before. And, I understand that upset some people, and I apologize for upsetting people. I hate to do that, but this is a difficult job. I had people I like on both sides lobbying me one way or the other, and there's no way I could make them all happy. But in the end, my constituents, I didn't get a lot of comments, maybe a dozen, but I didn't have one that supported the syringe program, and I had a dozen that didn't. And some of them were pretty strong in their opposition. So that's enough with the syringe program. Back to the budget, rating various funds to use for other purposes. When those funds get bloated in the budget, I suppose could be a legitimate practice, but I worry about the sustainability of that practice. Maybe those funds won't be as plentiful in the future. And I agree with Senator Jacobson, who said that, my business pays into the state unemployment tax fund, and I haven't had a claim for probably 20 years or more. And so my reserve is pretty high compared to what my wages that balance into that. And so my rate of tax is pretty small. But if it has 75 million in there and we haven't, there's not much prospect that we're going to spend it, they should just reduce the taxes so the businesses don't have to pay so much. And then as for what got swept and, a favorite project here or there of one senator or the other gets some funds swept, keep in mind that if you look on page 17 of the green budget book and you look down the general fund appropriations, I took my highlighter and highlighted all the social service expenditures, and out of the 5.125 billion of this, 34% of those funds were spent on social service programs. I mean, there's Medicaid, there's child welfare, developmental disabilities, public assistance, behavioral health, children's health insurance,
That's your time, Senator.
Anyway, 34% of the budget is already spent on social service things.
Thank you, Senator Mosier. Senator Aguilar would like to recognize some guests in the North Balcony. They are students from the Solling Boarding School in Holzminden, Germany. Please stand and be recognized by your Nebraska Legislature. Senator McDonald, you're recognized to speak, and this is your final time on the motion.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate Senator Dover going down to the office and bringing up all those binders, and it does give you kind of a perspective of the amount of work. And we're not saying as appropriations all the other committees don't work hard and put a number of hours in here. We've been talking about this bill now for 2.5 hours, and again, we can talk for the next 10, 12, 14 hours, whatever you think is necessary through the general file select and final reading, because we do want to answer all of your questions. But if you look at the process where it starts the mid-biennium with the governor's team and the agencies and fiscal office and the senators that serve on appropriations and the thousands and thousands of hours that we put into it, it just can't do it justice in this amount of time. So we understand, and when I go to other committees and testify, I really do appreciate the work that's going on. And as I'm waiting to testify on my bill, a lot of times I don't understand what's going on because you put so much time into it. And as appropriations, we put a lot of time into it. And I think like all of us, you get sometimes too close, the moth that gets too close to the flame sometimes because you're just working so hard on it. So we appreciate, we want your questions, and we want to try to get you your answers. If we can't get them right now, we sure will get them as quickly as we can. And I know fiscal office is there waiting to answer the questions, and the amount of expertise they have and the team they've built is really impressive. And I just, again, I can't thank them enough. So Senator Jacobson started talking about the unemployment insurance. And again, it gets me back to talking about the bill that I introduced on authorized workers. And going back, this became evident during the pandemic that there was some people that had to be laid off, no fault of their own, based on their employer just at that point had to shut down for a while because of the pandemic. And their employer had been paying unemployment insurance on that individual, and that individual is legally here. They're paying taxes, they're authorized, some have social security numbers, but at least they all have gone through the federal system with the as authorized workers. So at that point, those individuals, and I appreciate Senator Reapy, we're working on a couple things together, and if that goes anywhere, we'll see as we, but I know he's sincere and he's trying to come up with a compromise if he can. So that's why I'm bringing this up at this time. If we do want to lower the amount that the employer is paying, we can have that discussion. But currently, we have employers that are paying in and are asking, when I paid in on these employees, what happened? When they went down to collect unemployment and they'd done everything right, why? Why, if we're the only state that hasn't harmonized with the federal government, why haven't we? And again, as I brought up before, I believe it was a mistake. I believe it's a clerical error. You can title it anything you want. Otherwise, if it's not, it's a scam. And the dollars that we're trying to keep, we know that the employer's paid in, and on John Doe, Jane Doe, whoever that individual might be, we're never going to pay out. And that's just wrong. That's fundamentally wrong. And the idea of us trying to take care of that, again, hopefully we can before the end of this session. So lowering the amount of what the employer pays in, yes, we could have that discussion, but I think we should also make sure when the employer does pay in on their employees that we honor that and we harmonize with the federal government like the other states have throughout our great country, and we make sure those people are treated fairly. So back to the budget. Again, we're here to try to answer any of your questions. Again, thousands and thousands of hours have been put in. If we can't get the answer, for you immediately, we're sure going to work on it. And if you want to, again, ask us this evening, tomorrow morning on the mic now, if you want us to prepare for something for tomorrow, please tell us. But we're here and we're your appropriations committee. And again, it's not an easy process, but I stand behind the work we've done and the process we've gone through as I have for the last 8 years. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator McDonald. Senator McKinney, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise still in support of the motion to indefinitely postpone LB 1412, mainly because I think it's great that we're having a great discussion about the budget and what's going on within the budget, because there's a lot of things going on, a lot of moving pieces, and I think it's fair to try to discuss these things. I'm just wondering about, again, our priorities as a state. I've received explanations why the Rural Workforce Housing Fund is getting $20 million and the Middle Income Workforce Housing Fund is only getting $5 million. Even after listening to why, I still don't believe it's equitable, mainly because last year, there was efforts to put more money into both these funds, and there was a veto of, I think, 40 million or something like that. It might be less, but there was a veto of money that was going to affordable housing. And I'm just wondering what changed from last year to this year, because if it wasn't good enough to be in the budget last year, what happened this year? What happened over the interim? And also, why isn't it equitable? Some people have told me that each program or fund has different allocations of money, and one has maybe received more than the other or something like that. If somebody could give me some historical data on what has went into both funds over the past 4 years, I would love to see it from all things that you could get resources from, whether it's federal dollars or state dollars, grants or whatever. I would like to see, oh, somebody's alarm's going off. But I would like to see a historical breakdown of the Rural Workforce Housing Fund and the Middle Income Workforce Housing Fund. And I would like to see every dollar since 2020 that was appropriated to each fund to see if one fund has actually received more than the other. So I'll probably go talk to fiscal or somebody around here to see the actual breakdown. I'm not saying anybody did not tell me the truth. I just want to see it with my eyes, whether or not the Middle Income Workforce Housing Fund has received more dollars than the rural. It might be true, so it might be understandable why there's a difference in the amounts going to rural, but I would like to see it. And if it's not true, I think both should be funded the same. That's my only, not my only issue with this budget, but that's one of them. We had conversations about the ARPA funds, and my point on that is once those funds are not are unobligated July 1, 2024, I'm also curious, maybe we'll have to do it on select or sometime over the next couple of days to add in an amendment to say that those unobligated dollars shall go into the economic recovery contingency fund or another fund, just so we could specifically have that.
1 minute.
So it's not up for debate next year or into question, that we specifically put language in, because to some people, intent language is intent language, and depending on the year, those agreements don't matter. So those are my things that I would like addressed. So I'll probably go talk to somebody in fiscal or somewhere else to get a historical breakdown of the rural workforce housing fund and the middle income workforce housing fund. And I want to see every dollar that was appropriated to both funds totaled to see if there's an actual difference between the two. Maybe there is, and maybe I'll sit down and say, you guys are right. I'm not saying anybody lied to me. I just would like to see it. And I also would like some stronger language in the budget, in statute, that says unobligated dollars goes to North and South Omaha. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator McKinney. Senator John Kavanaugh, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. While I've been listening, I appreciate conversation from everybody, and I think there's a lot of good points that are made, a lot of interesting points. I was kind of taken by one of the comments Senator Conrad made a few minutes ago about, and I was just trying to find it here. I'm looking through the general fund transfers in, and Senator Conrad is talking about the Attorney General's, there it is, the State Settlement Cash Fund. And I thought that was really interesting because it's kind of a microcosm of the whole thing we're talking about here, which is to transfer funds that are intended for one purpose to another purpose. And Senator Conrad went through a couple of the settlements where the funds have come from. And I was just thinking, why do we get this money, right? So you have a settlement. She referenced, I think, a Juul, which is, I think, a vaping company, some sort of settlement. My guess is, and I don't know this for a fact, but when the Attorney General enters into a lawsuit for whatever, deceptive business practices or something, and then gets a settlement, that money is meant for the people who were harmed by it. And so that, either goes to programming to help people who had been, taken in by, say, a deceptive business practice, or people who are actually harmed by whatever it is, the, unsafe equipment or something along those lines. There's lots of these other, you can have a lawsuit about, there's a certain type of car right now that is easy to steal with like a USB or something like that. And those companies that make the car are not recalling it because it's basically cheaper for them, and they're not interested in doing that. So if we were to engage in the lawsuit, which I know other states have engaged in, to receive some sort of settlement from that, I would think that the idea of that settlement would be to help make whole those Nebraskans who are harmed by that, either in the repair to their car or the replacement to a car that was stolen because of the known defect. But it's not meant for property tax relief. It's not meant to backfill our budget when we have made a tremendous cut in corporate and income taxes for a lot of higher income earners in the state, and then to balance our budget artificially, which I guess seems like that's what's happening here. We've got all these cash funds, which each one of them has their own, merits to why they exist, and maybe perhaps have been structured in a way where we have a large amount of money that we maybe don't need to collect, but it really is an indication of the fact that we should be doing a better job of either decreasing whatever fee we're assessing against people and spending the money as it was intended, not letting it pile up until we have, in this case, 198 million that people can argue we could take. So that kind of brings me to my other original point, which was Senator Erdman was talking about this, that, we're not in unprecedented great times right now, that we're staring down the potential of bad times. And you can go to page 12 of the Green Book. You can see the historical average where it goes up in revenue and down in revenue. Historical average is 5.3%, which means we take out, we average over, we have a couple years that are in the almost 20%, but to get to 5.3% on average, a 20% increase.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. Has to have a equal decrease, which means we have potential decreases in revenues coming forward. And then we have right now it's 500. I guess I'm not going to have time to find it in the budget. I'll push my light again. But we have something about $500 million above what we need in the cash reserves. And then we'll go in the future to 68 million, I think, if I recall from Senator Clement's briefing this morning. But my question is, if we weren't taking these funds from things like the settlement cash fund and the unemployment insurance fund, would we have a structural deficit in the out years based off of our revenues and our expenditures? And that is problematic, right? If we're looking at this and saying we're not going to have enough money to meet our obligations and we can't go back to this well time and again. The 70 million has taken years to build up on the unemployment fund. Those $10 million.
That's your time.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh. Senator Dover, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you. Just to switch gears a little bit here. So I think most of you, I've talked to a number of you, and I think a lot of you will remember that we did fund an efficiency study with Kristen Cox, who is, I would say, one of the most intelligent people I've ever met, and she was very, very refreshing to meet her here. And I just want to go over quickly. We appropriated $2.5 million per year, basically for 4 years, and that would be a total of $10 million, which I thought, well, that's a lot of money. And so basically, I just wanted, but it's a performance contract, and so in order to get that, to draw that full amount of the contract, she would need to find 3% savings this year, and then next year, 24-25, she needed to find a 6% savings. So what does that mean? So in 23-24, our general funds appropriated were $5,364,490,910, and a 3% savings would be $160,934,727. And then in 24-25, our general funds appropriated was $5,443,357,580, and in order to perform in the contract to get paid what we appropriated, she would need to find a 6% savings, which would be a total of $326,601,455. So how does that total up to be? So basically, you can take the averages and you can take the 3% and the 6% average out, it ends up being about 4.5%. So if you look at the total appropriated for both those years, it'd be $10,807,848,490 times by 4.5 ends up being a total savings of $487,536,182, or basically a $500 million savings through the efficiency study. And so you wonder, well, are we paying a lot of money? It seems like a lot of money if you're thinking $2.5 million per year over 4 years for $10 million. But if you just look at those 2 years of $2.5 million for a total contract amount of $5 million, that's 1% of the appropriated amount. And I think if she can find a $500 million savings, I think that it will be well earned. One thing I would say too is we did our, I don't want to echo what anybody else has said, but we do our budget. We did our budget last session, right? And so we look at deficiencies, and agencies come in and say they need a little more money or whatever it may be. But really, we did the budget, so there really shouldn't be many changes. And just so you know, conversations we're having in appropriations was, we tend to put Band-Aids on things. So we run out there, so we've got this problem, so we put a Band-Aid here, we put a Band-Aid there, and it doesn't really end up being a really smooth, well-oiled machine or a linear process or those kind of things. And that's basically what she was hired to do. So be quite truthful, when we tried to fix things, I had I was a little reserved to fund fixes because I really wanted to see what she was able to do. And truthfully, in the meetings we've had with her, that I've had with them, was she really believes that she can do as much with less, or she can take care of more people throughout the agencies with the same amount of money. And I yield my time back to the chair.
Thank you, Senator Dover. Senator Lippincott, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, sir. Several questions have been asked regarding clarity and numbers and such on some of these housing programs that we have. And I would agree with many that it is somewhat confusing. We've got the Rural Workforce Housing Investment Fund. We've got the Middle Income Workforce Housing Investment Fund. We've got the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So what are they? Let's talk about that briefly. And it's in the Irish Green book here on page 40. And I would start at the top where it talks in the section titled the Department of Economic Development. And just as a very brief review here, the Rural Workforce Housing Bill was started back in 2017, a few years ago, with LB 518. It has gone through some evolution. I'll try to cover that very briefly. In fact, as a matter of fact, I introduced LB 897 earlier on this session for $20 million for rural workforce housing, but that's been gobbled up in the governor's budget, so that's good. Who cares who gets the credit? We just need to get the money where it needs to go to. LB 850 amended the earmark relating to the appropriations of the American Rescue Plan, ARPA, and was appropriated by LB 1014 in 2022, a couple years ago, for the purpose of issuing grants under the Rural Workforce Housing Investment Act. And then I would drop down to that paragraph, the last two sentences, which says it would have the effect of making the program a loan rather than a grant program. So LB 850 amends the earmark to make the program work as a grant, which is the original intent of the legislature. That's all on page 40. Then flip back a few pages onto page 35. And just as a brief overview of the definition of what those programs are, the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, that is driven by the income of the individuals who want to take residence of the facility. They have to be either 100% qualified of the definition of low income according to federal poverty levels, or very low income. So take, for instance, an individual qualifying for low income would have an income of $15,060 per year. Very low income would be $12,048. And I've got numbers here for a family of 2, family of 3, family of 4. But again, Affordable Housing Trust Fund is driven by the income of its occupants. That's Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Then the Rural Workforce Housing, that are for homes of $250,000 or less, with a match of 25% from the local cities, county, the entity that has applied for this rural workforce housing. It's for first class, second class, and village cities. So it'd be all towns with the exception of Lincoln and Omaha, and I will come to you in just a moment. That's rural workforce housing. So we talked about the affordable housing, rural workforce housing, now middle income. What qualifies for the Middle Income Workforce Housing Investment Fund? That is driven not by the occupants of the house, but instead the cost of the house, which would be no more than $350,000, with half the award matched by the city or district. Now, dropping down to Lincoln and Omaha, down to the middle of the page on page 35 in your green book, it says, in addition to the affordable, rural, and middle workforce funds, through ARPA, housing in Lincoln received $20 million, housing in Omaha, $20 million. And then I'll drop down to the bottom sentence. It says projected fund of the affordable housing at the beginning of fiscal year this year and next is estimated to be approximately $16 million. And I believe that Senator McKinney was asking about that specifically a few moments ago. The transfers require amending the provisions of the fund to allow transfer from the Middle Income Workforce Housing Investment Fund. So again, affordable housing, They should have $16 million in their fund. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator Lippincott. Senator Linehan, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am against the amendment to definitely postpone, and I'm supporting LB 1412. Doesn't mean that there might not be an amendment later in the conversation that I would vote for or vote against. I appreciate all the work the appropriators have done. I also think that we should have a real debate about the budget. I've been here years when nobody could talk because somebody filed amendments and they were the only one that got to talk on the budget for 8 hours. So I think this is very healthy. There have been a couple of things that I've heard this afternoon, though, that I just want to clarify for the record. Property tax that's not sustainable, and we had a vote last year on a big property tax bill, and if you turn to page 17 in your green book this year, we're a green book, it lays out the first property tax credit, which was started back in 2007 and 2008. But last year we increased it. You can see the chart there, and we've increased it more than the last year. On this chart is 26, 27, actually in 28. This account, which is what we call Tier 1, which original property tax credit fund, or I heard today somebody calls it the real property tax credit fund. That was a new name. That will go up to $475 million in 2028. Now, here is the vote on that bill last year, which was May 25th, 2023. There were 44 yes votes and no votes. That bill also increased the property tax. I think I call it Tier 2, but I think the appropriate name is the Property Tax Credit Incentive Act, because it was part of 1107, which we increased significantly last year as well, up from like 500 and some up to, it gets to 740. Anyway, it's over $1 billion in tax relief. It's already in the budget, and you already all voted for it. Well, nobody voted against it, and most of you voted for it. So I don't think, talking about that relief, what the governor is proposing is taking that second tier and front-loading it. It wouldn't cost any more money. So when we talk about property taxes during this debate, which I'm not going to involve myself too much in the budget because I haven't spent a lot of time studying the budget. Again, I'm not saying it's perfect, and there might be an amendment I would support. But when we get up and use words like unsustainable and we can't afford this, it irritates me because we are in such amazing financial shape here. If you look at page 10, we have, at the end of 23-24, our estimate is here that we will have 914.6 or 0.5, won't quibble over the change, million in the cash reserve fund. Almost $1 billion. And then if you go to page 33, we have the Education Future Fund, which is in addition to the cash fund, and you can read the numbers there. We will have fund balance at the end of 23-24, $677 million, end of 24-25, $618 million. So it's not like we're not being frugal. And we've increased education funding all across the board. What the governor is proposing is hard, but the Revenue Committee is working on it. So I would like just one request here. I would like people to not talk about those bills until we bring them to the floor. This is appropriations. The money for that we've already, it's $1 billion, folks, since we got here. Well, some of us got here in 2017. It's over $1 billion we've already done in property tax relief. And when I hand out this chart, let me make sure it's right. On average today in Nebraska, for every man, woman, and child, we are paying $2,234 per person in property taxes. That's after you take out the relief. Again, $2,234 per person, not per taxpayer, per person. It's too much, guys. That's what's not sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Linehan. Senator Blood, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Fellow senators, friends all, I always enjoy when Senator Linehan gets up and speak. I don't always agree with her, but she always gives us good information. And the question that came up when I heard her talking today is, if we're in such good financial shape, then why don't we reconsider how we're spending those funds for the greater good of all Nebraskans outside of property taxes? And I think that that's the issue. And I've tried to speak on the bills that are included in the fiscal note when I spoke previously. And the fiscal note specifically talked about the Sustainable Water Fund. So I feel like I've tried to do that. I do stand in favor of IPP motion because it's slowing us down and it's giving us time to speak. And Senator Linehan said, it's good for us to have a real debate and discuss things, not just be killing time. But as I look at the concerns everybody's expressed today and see that I've only had to leave the floor once because I had to talk to a group, I've listened to the concerns that people had. I remembered when everybody was so thrilled when we passed LB 276, I believe that was the Wishart bill last year. And that was in reference to statewide behavioral health model. And And I remember our governor, he has this buzzword that he says all the time. It's transformational funding. He says the word transformational a lot. But then the next year he comes back. It's very yin and yang, right? The next year he comes back and he wants to sweep out 14, 15 million wrong-headed decision in reference to behavioral health. So here we fund it, then we take it away. We saw that when our employees got a raise. Here's a raise, hey, but you can't work remotely anymore. We saw that at LRC. Hey, here's a raise and we're going to hire new staff, but hey, we can't bother to get you the training you want, so you're going to have to tough it out and keep getting assaulted at LRC. I just remember the quote in reference to the behavioral health bill last year. And I went to the press release to make sure I remembered it correctly. So this is a direct quote. It is important that we offer help, and Senator Hunt, I hope you're listening to this quote. It is important that we offer help to Nebraskans who suffer from mental health issues and substance abuse problems, said Governor Pillen. This piece of legislation will help to transform mental health and substance abuse services in Nebraska. So this was in reference to the CCBHC. It's about whole person integrated care to communities. Again, I go back to strategic planning. Everything ebbs and flows between governors, between this body, because we have term limits. We have so many special interest groups that seem to have so much power on this floor now. We can't seem to be able to go in the right direction on any one topic. Senator Conrad kind of took the wind out of my sails when she talked about the Attorney General's office, but she did miss the one bill that was in Judiciary this year, which was a consumer protection bill that pertained to the use of images of sex trafficking victims. Well, first of all, they already have that power to do something legally. But now they want to have it in statute so they can benefit, not give the money to victims, but keep the money, just like they've done with all those lawsuits. We're going in the wrong direction. Our budget is going in the wrong direction. You guys have worked so hard, and I know the parameters that were set for you were hard.
1 minute.
But my concern is, this is not the Nebraska I thought we were headed for. I thought that we're a compassionate Nebraska, that mental health was a key issue. And we were passing, apparently last year, transformative legislation. But then with the same hand that gave you the money, we slapped you with it. So I'm confused and disappointed. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Blood. Senator DeBoer, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, colleagues. I share a number of the concerns that other members do writ large about cash transfers and using one-time fees or one-time monies for trying to sustain the program. But I do want to point out one specific question I have. If you turn to page 20 in the budget book, the Nebraska Universal Service Fund, this budget, it's actually in 1413, not 1412, but we're talking about these things, so I thought I would talk about them. It says that beginning in 24-25, all interest earned on the Universal Service Fund minus any amount transferred to 211 cash fund is transferred to the general fund. This is an ongoing provision not limited to 24-25. So here is an ongoing change, and it's one that I want to draw your attention to, colleagues, because we've had a number of conversations on this floor about broadband and getting broadband out into the entire state. The Universal Service Fund, for those of you who are not on the Transportation and Telecommunications Committee, is used for a number of things. It's used in some ways to build out. We have some programs that it helps to build out in those rural areas. But it also is used for sustaining those areas where we have high cost areas in our state, these very rural areas. And the fund was having lower and lower receipts until a couple of years ago. We changed how we collected funds there. Now it's stable. It's sort of static, the amount we're getting in. But here's the concern I want to flag your attention to, colleagues, and that is that we're going to have a much greater need for those high cost supports when we build this broadband out throughout the state. There are places that we are building fiber to in this state that there just isn't any kind of business model, not just for building it out, but also for keeping it going. So one thing that we may not always talk about so much is that once you build fiber to somebody, you don't just get to walk away and sort of wipe your hands free of it. There are all sorts of little component parts. The fiber itself, even if it's okay, and we can talk about that in a second, there are all these little component parts to transfer this or that, or all different little computer pieces and things like that that are needed. Those things have to be changed every few years. We might have all the fiber in the ground in the world. If we can't keep it going, we're going to be in trouble. This is something that we have committed lots of money to as a state, and to say that we're now going to start peeling away money, even if it's just the interest, which legally is allowed, we can't take the actual money, but if we're taking the interest away from the NUSF fund at a time when we are going to have much greater need for it to support those high cost areas, this isn't something that my constituents are going to suffer from. But it might be something that your constituents are going to suffer from if you're in those areas where there's high cost broadband out in the more rural parts of this state. I want to draw your attention to the fact that we need not just to have a sustained NUSF fund, but to be growing our NUSF fund in anticipation of this greater need. There are component parts that have to be replaced every few years, and there is maintenance. There's maintenance to the fiber. You can't just dig it once, put it in, and walk away from it because it gets cut. There are problems with it. These things have to be paid attention to. And I am very concerned about what happens, not just you get broadband for 1 week and you're happy about it, you want it to keep going. So I would very much like to discuss this particular change, as this is a permanent taking of the interest from the NUSF fund. And I think that that is counter to the policy this body has set of wanting to long-term sustain internet throughout this state. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator DeBoer. Senator Dungan, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. And again, colleagues, I rise still unsure as to how I'm going to vote, I think, on the underlying LB 1412 and some of the other amendments. But I wanted to pick up where I left off with my conversation previously with regards to court interpreters. Members in this body who are paying attention last year and this year probably remember we've discussed this quite a bit already. So I want to walk us through, I think, a little bit of to where we came from and where we are now on the issue of the court interpreters, because it continues to be a really, really pressing issue that I think we need to address as a body here today, and I'll get to why here in a moment. So you may recall last session, I had brought a bill to the Appropriations Committee asking for, I believe, $1.2 million to be appropriated to the Supreme Court, the agency of the Supreme Court, spread across the biennium last year and this year, in order to increase the base pay that we pay for court interpreters who provide court interpretation services, both for hard of hearing people, so sign language, but also non-English speaking folks in our court system. And ultimately, that bill was not directly incorporated into the budget, but we as a body voted an amendment into the budget to put about $400,000 spread across 2 bienniums in there for the Supreme Court. In my opinion, it was not an ample amount for the increase in their pay, but it was something that we could actually put in the budget and continue to have conversations about moving forward. Unfortunately, that bipartisan amendment that was added into the budget with, I think, 35-ish, maybe higher votes, was line item vetoed. We did attempt a veto override, but I understand there wasn't much of an appetite for that last year. And so unfortunately, we left last year in this biennium with the court interpreters not being, or the Supreme Court not being provided the additional funding it needed to increase the base pay for those court interpreters. One thing about our court interpreters that I want to make sure people realize is they don't work for the courts. These are private contractors, essentially small business owners who work through contracts with our court system in order to ensure that we can provide court interpretation services for folks in our court. The reason we do this is we're actually statutorily required and constitutionally required to do so. Nebraska Revised Statute 252401 says, "It is hereby declared to be the policy of this state that the constitutional rights of persons unable to communicate the English language cannot be fully protected unless interpreters are available to assist such persons in legal proceedings." What that ultimately led to was essentially a structure being set up wherein court interpreters were paid starting in 2004 if they were certified court interpreters, meaning they'd done certain processes and procedures of testing, to be paid $50 an hour. And if they were a non-certified court interpreter and simply just registered at the court, they would get $35 an hour. That was in 2004. They have not received or had not received a pay raise at all since 2004 when I brought my bill last year. If you do the math on inflation of the dollars between that money as it was in 2004 and where it was now, simply I think an $85 an hour agreement would keep up with inflation. And so that is ultimately what they were seeking, was I believe $85 an hour for certified court interpreters. But unfortunately, because that got vetoed out of our budget, the court interpreters were not able to, at the end of last session, receive any pay raise because the Supreme Court was not able to pay for that, given the fact that their cash funds and other funds were already essentially going towards a bunch of other programs, which we'll get more into in a little bit. Because of that, there was in fact a work stoppage. I want to say that again, colleagues. There was a work stoppage where our court interpreters, large chunks of them, were unable to actually make ends meet. So they were not going into court and they were not able to.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President, to conduct hearings. They were not able to translate or interpret, rather, for attorneys or judges. And it led to weeks of halted cases all across the state, urban and rural. And it was a real problem. I was contacted by attorneys. I was contacted by judges saying, how did this happen? Why did this happen? And the answer was, we, colleagues, were unable to provide the funding that they needed to increase their pay. So I know I'm running out of time. I guess I'll leave you on a cliffhanger. I'm probably not going to get to talk again, but that's where we left ourselves last session, was our court interpreters were not able to go to work. There were hearings that were not happening. And I hope we can address it this session. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Dungan. Senator Bostelman, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, colleagues. Broadband? Broadband? Did I hear broadband? Senator DeBoer, did you bring up broadband? I think Senator DeBoer did. I've never talked about the broadband on the mic before, I don't think. Well, maybe I have once or twice. I agree with Senator DeBoer, what she was talking about. I just want to echo what she was saying. The USF funds, though we show the interest coming off of that's critically important to broadband, especially in rural Nebraska. We're doing a lot of the Bridge Act, capital projects, speed funding, other funding is coming into the state. Tens of millions of dollars that we're utilizing to build broadband across the state, and the USF funds that are out there, and USF funds are out there as part of some clawback money that's there that from those that didn't build out. But it's also there, the most important thing with that is you may look at that a number and think it's a large number, but as we're building out across the state, there has to be upkeep and maintenance on all these facilities. So we don't want to build a state-of-the-art broadband facility, if you will, and then not have any funds to make sure it's maintained and upkept. So I think we'll be talking about here on another bill we have on the agenda I have here a little bit later, but broadband, it's that word broadband, and it's very important to Nebraska. It's very important to our economy in Nebraska. So even though it's on, as Senator DeBoer said, 1413, we're talking about different bills, different things today. That is something we need to take a look at. I believe there's probably going to be an amendment coming up on that on 1413, which we'll talk about it again, but it is a very important opportunity to discuss that. Bottom line, though, is saying that I want to thank the Appropriations Committee, Chairman Clements, and those members on the Appropriations Committee for all the hard work that they did do on that. It's not an easy job to do. They have a lot of work that they set through and do throughout the starting of a session. For those of you who aren't aware, they have probably the most bills and most time spent next to Judiciary or HHS. And I appreciate all the work that they did and they do. I do not stand in support of the IPP motion. I do stand in support of LB 1412, and I believe there may be an additional amendment or two that will come to that. But I could not resist with Senator DeBoer speaking of broadband, the importance of the USF funds to broadband. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Bostoman. Mr. Clerk for items.
Mr. President, I have a communication from the governor and gross legislative bills 992E and 992A were received in my office on March 7, 2024 and signed on March 12, 2024. These bills were delivered to the Secretary of State on March 12, 2024. Sincerely signed, Jim Pilling, Governor. Additionally, your Committee on Education, chaired by Senator Merman, reports Legislative Bill 1329 to general file with committee amendments. Series of motions to be printed from Senate and amendments to be printed from Senator Kavanaugh, Clements to LB 1412. Additionally, amendments to be printed from Senator Kavanaugh and motions from Senator Kavanaugh and Clements to LB 1413, and series of amendments from Senator Merman to LB 1392. New A bill, Senator Conrad, Legislative Bill 43A. It's a bill for enacting new appropriations to appropriate funds to aid in the carrying out of provisions, Legislative Bill 43, and to declare an emergency. Notice of hearing from the Education Committee. Name add, Senator DeBoer, name added to LB 857, 876, 829, and 934, and Senator McDonald, name added to LB 1408. Finally, Mr. President, a priority motion. Senator Holcroft would move to adjourn the body until Wednesday, March 13, 2024 at 9:00 a.m.
Members, you've heard the motion to adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed say nay. We are adjourned.